So, first of all, what a wonderful experience being here so far, and thank you for having me, especially as far as Marie, for having invited me. It's a 20-hour flight to get here. The only other flight that was nearly as long was Tokyo, which was 16 from Chicago. But well worth every minute of it, because I have met friends that I've only communicated with via Facebook and email so far, and we've made, as far as friendships, that I'm sure will last the rest of my life. And that was certainly the case as far as with what impacted me early on in ufology. But I had the grand experience, as Jamie mentioned, working for the late Dr. J. Allen Hynek. Is there anyone here, when I mention Dr. J. Allen Hynek, that I need to explain who he was? You're talking about the true father of contemporary ufology. You're talking about someone who was a skeptic, and then as a scientist, he was enough of a scientist that when the truth stared him in the face, the reality of the phenomena that we were dealing with, that he finally had to concede, I was wrong. And I could not have been more fortunate having him as my teacher, my mentor, my scientific director, and then to be blessed by having him say, Don, I want you to serve as one of my special investigators. I want you to actually work in the field with me. And there was nothing worse than being at that time. Now just imagine, he was only in his late 60s at this time. And he would constantly, I'm an old man in a hurry. I'm an old man in a hurry. And to me, I don't believe there's anything worse to feel that at that stage in your life, you then need to finally accomplish something. You need to finish the mission, so to speak. And I, for one, I certainly don't want to get to that point. I want to feel as though at some stage in my life I can say, mission accomplished. We've done all we could. And the book you see here, there, revised edition. This was the #1 selling UFO book in the world for 3 years. And it wasn't because the skeptics were buying it out. It wasn't because they were boycotting or making sure the truth didn't get out. And then when I started to have attorneys, doctors, I had a judge tell me that for having read the book as a complete skeptic, that he finally realized it was all true. The preponderance of eyewitness testimony was such that you just can't all be liars, and that was something that Hynek drilled into us over and over again, that at a certain point of consulting with Project Blue Book, he just realized that all it takes is one of these people to be telling the truth. Just one. And just like that, we're dealing with the technology off the planet. And just as Hynek had been a skeptic on UFOs, I had been a skeptic on Roswell. Back in 1988, when I met with Stanton Friedman, and I'd known Stan for years before, and we were backstage after he had put on a presentation at a college in Illinois, north of Chicago, Lakeland College to be exact. And I asked him, Stan, do you feel you've taken the case as far as you can? Do you feel that you've tracked down and interviewed every potential witness? And I was quite surprised when he said, well, no, Don, absolutely not. I'm sure there are still hundreds of potential witnesses out there. Because unlike a typical UFO case, that is a fleeting moment. Now you see it, now you don't. All of you who know as far as the basis of Roswell that it was a recovery of a craft of unknown origin. That was exactly how it was described at the time. Craft of unknown origin. So you have people who are involved in every phase of discovery to informants, to the initial recovery operation, those involved with the retrieval, those as far as different stages of the military involvement, the crating up, the shipping out, the flying out, and then going up that chain of involvement. So you have from dozens to hundreds and hundreds more, on and on and on, because you're dealing with the recovery of physical evidence, hardware, nuts and bolts. As I say, I like to go across the street and kick the tires. So this was way beyond anything that Hynek had the opportunity of investigating. With him, it was strictly photographs, reports, both military and civilian, and then dealing with the United States Air Force that was doing all they could to explain this away. The silly season, as they called it back in summer of 1947. So I'm meeting with Stan Friedman, and he's telling me, Don, it's wide open. It's there for you if you want to pick up the gauntlet and investigate this further. But what I didn't tell Stan was, I was a complete skeptic. I thought we would make a single weekend jaunt down to New Mexico and prove that this was a weather balloon device, as the government still maintains back in the States, or something just as prosaic, just as conventional. And then as things took off, the books, the movie that Jamie talked about, meeting more and more celebrity, I want to just give you an example of the type of people you run into, not related to the case directly, but the effects, the impact it has on people within even their own professions. And I'm going to cite the example of maybe somebody that you might have heard of, though I doubt it. Someone who, internationally known for his portrayal of Captain James T. Kirk. So when I mention the name William Shatner, a few of you might know who that is, right? No, we all do, correct? Captain Kirk, William Shatner. Within a few years after we started our Roswell investigation, I was invited to speak at a science fiction convention. And I was kind of reluctant because one of the things, especially back in the States, and I realized, I observed this firsthand, what science fiction fans resent is that anything that threatens their territory, in other words, anything that makes their science fiction science reality, they take personally. And yet, I found them to be the most receptive, the most responsive, some of the most intelligent audiences I ever spoke in front of. And then when I was invited to be part of a two-man presentation, or man and woman presentation, I would do an hour on Roswell, and then they would have a celebrity, like a John Delancey, or Walter Koenig, George Takei. And then when I was asked, would you be interested in going on the road with William Shatner? And I first asked, well, what does he think about my topic, my background, my profession? Oh, he's totally interested. In fact, he already said he's got 100 questions for you. It would be an hour of you doing Roswell, and then it would be an hour of Bill Shatner doing, his own Q&A. You'd sign autographs, and then we would move on and do another show the next day. And I thought, my God, I was never a Star Trek fan, but it's still William Shatner. Accompanying, of course. So, we're speaking at the Coliseum in Lubbock, Texas. And I'm picked up at the airport, and I'm driven to the Coliseum, and there's a limo parked in back. And the producer, whose name was Rick Starnes, told me, Don, just get in the back of the limo and we'll call you when we're ready. And I crawl in through the back door and I sit down and I look up. And there sitting across from me is Bill Shatner. And he immediately leans forward and he goes, Don, it's such a pleasure to meet you. I have 1,000 questions. Well, I first was told it's only 100. Now he's telling me 1,000 questions. And he starts to pepper me with, queries on Roswell, UFOs, but specifically Roswell. And we hit it off immediately. And we would then, from Lubbock, need to fly and then connect another flight at Dallas to fly down to San Antonio for a show that evening at the San Antonio Theater. And I will never forget racing through the Dallas airport. And it was Bill Shatner, myself, and the producer, Rick Starnes. And Shatner has this large leather garment bag over his shoulder. As big as a saddle, a horse's saddle. And he's wearing these little granny sunglasses. And he's kind of trotting ahead of us and come on boys, we got to catch your flight. And up stairways instead of escalators, and everyone is doing double takes and pointing and Captain Kirk, Bill Shatner, that type of thing. And so we arrive in San Antonio. Limo is waiting, take us to the theater, and we're pulling up in front of the San Antonio Theater. And there are people lined up on both sides of the street. And he taps me on the arm and he goes, look at that, Don, look at that. We have a sellout. And I look out my window, and there, on the marquee of the Alamo Dome, tonight only, the Rolling Stones. So I'm, Bill, and he, oh, no, we're doomed. So he wouldn't come out of the green room. He sat there, just devastated that of all nights we have to compete with the Rolling Stones. And all at once, Rick Starnes comes bursting into the room, we got a sellout. And Shatner, I knew it, I had no doubt. And so it was 2,500 people, the upper balcony, and it was just great. And every time I hear that Roswell is passé or that we've taken it, we've done all we can with it. And as Jamie mentioned, we just received the contracts. We're doing a 6-part series with History Channel on the families. It's going to focus on the Marcel grandkids. Major Jesse Marcel, who was head of intelligence at the base in 1947. And so, again, another fresh look at what the families went through. It was the reason we did the book, Children of Roswell, because they had a story to tell as well. They witnessed their fathers, their parents, their husbands, who lived through an experience that, and one of the things that I hope you walk away with later this afternoon, that no matter if we're talking about the children who were involved all the way up to the senior officers, you could have been a 2-star general back in 1947, and their reaction was the same to what happened back at that time. From the most inexperienced child to the highest trained military officer, they reacted extraordinarily to an extraordinary event. No one is going to ever demonstrate to me otherwise. In fact, I had a trained psychiatrist say that's the one thing that convinced him when I wrote a very paper on that very fact. The human response to an extraordinary event was the paper I wrote. And I pointed out case after case where, again, people reacted profoundly to something that they couldn't explain. And I would hardly qualify for a weather balloon device or anything else just as conventional. I'm just going to, again, I mentioned Bill Shatner. How many recognize the late Dr. Edgar Mitchell? Apollo 14, walked on the moon. You don't count, Jamie. And if you might have noticed, if you look down at the bottom, and isn't it interesting how small, forward by Edgar Mitchell, afterward by George Norrie? I mean, Edgar Mitchell's name should have been as big as Roswell as far as I'm concerned. But the point is, he did our forward. And he didn't do it just because we asked him. Because where did Edgar Mitchell go to high school back in 1947? But Roswell. He knew a lot of the men who were involved personally. He could describe to us that before the incident, many of them were very social, were friendly to the local townspeople because they had a heavy burden back at the base. And mainly for the fact that they were the first atomic bomb squadron in the world, headquartered at Roswell. It was the elite within the United States military at that time. Best officers, pilots, crewmen, doctors, nurses. If you swept the broom on that base back in 1947, you were the best broom sweeper in the entire military at that time, because you were going to be in charge of the atomic bomb. And so Mitchell noticed that immediately after the incident, and when Washington, D.C. came up with the alternative explanation that it was nothing more than a weather balloon device, there was a major change in attitude. They didn't fraternize, they didn't talk any longer. It was as though all his friends at the base were told not to say another word to the people because they might ask you, and you might slip. You might say the wrong thing, and they will then ask you another question, another question. So the best thing to do is essentially place a gag order on everyone working at the base at that time. Don't socialize with any of the civilians, the locals in town, from here on. And for Mitchell, as a young high school boy at that time, he was quite upset by it. And it wasn't until years later he realized maybe it's because the balloon story was not the truth, was not the correct one. And these people, the personnel headquartered at the base, stationed at the base, they couldn't talk about it. And so as the years went by, and Mitchell went on to MIT, it's where he received his doctorate in engineering. He then went into the space program, where he became trained astronaut. And he spent time also working at the Pentagon. And one of the things that he described to us that he went out of his way while having that opportunity was searching out the Roswell file, looking for data, looking for information that was more truthful than the balloon story that we had been led to believe all those years. And he found names, and he tracked down those officers, and he would describe to me that one by one, these officers would confide to him what really happened. And Mitchell would describe that not a one of them said this was a balloon, a plane, a rocket, or anything else conventional. One time I'm doing a radio interview with Dr. Mitchell, and I'm a little surprised that he's being a little coy. He's not really admitting anything. And we broke for a commercial during the live telecast. And all at once he leans back in his chair between the boom microphone that we swung between us, and he goes, "Did Colonel Easley ever say anything to you about the bodies?" And I said, well, as a matter of fact, we couldn't get him to talk to us. He went on and on that I'm still sworn to secrecy. We have him on recorded phone conversation. Don't ask me, I'm still sworn to secrecy. This was in 1990. 43 years after the incident, he's still saying, I'm still sworn to secrecy. 2 years later, he was dying of stomach cancer at Parkland Hospital, Dallas, Texas, where John F. Kennedy was pronounced dead. And his granddaughter, in the presence of his 2 daughters, there in his hospital room, she walks to his bedside and holds something up to his face. And he turns away and goes, "Oh, the creatures." And he goes on to describe how it was the president who had asked them never to say another word about this, and how much he regretted that he could not share the truth with his own family. But it was what he, as a good soldier, was asked to do. What his granddaughter had brought him was one of our books, The Truth About the UFO Crash at Roswell. And his reaction was, "Oh, the creatures." And so I passed that on to Dr. Mitchell. And all he would say to me was, he pretty much told me the same thing. He told me how the bodies weren't from here. And oh yes, there were bodies recovered. And so to have a major American astronaut, Apollo 14, walked on the moon, not only share a discussion with me on the 1947 incident, but then to do the ultimate honor of writing the foreword to one of our books. You think it's because he was saying, "Don't believe a word in this tome"? Or he was placing his endorsement on the fact that what you're about to read, ladies and gentlemen, is the truth. What greater honor. I guess I could say I'd also like Bill Shatner to write a foreword, but I certainly was more blessed to have the late Dr. Edgar Mitchell. George Norrie, do you get Coast to Coast here in Australia? It's the #1 nighttime radio show in America, Coast to Coast. You've heard of Art Bell, right? Norrie was the one who then, took over the show after Bell would say he was threatened or he was retiring. He did it 3 times. He'd come back, and the last time Norrie took over, and he's been at the helm ever since. But Norrie doesn't write forewords. He doesn't write afterwards. He wrote our afterword, and in it he stated, "I was always on the fence with Roswell until I read this book, and now I'm 100% convinced." Again, talk about just a tremendous accolade, a tremendous endorsement. And it humbles me. It humbles me in that I am invited to speak as here, all over the world. Last year to China 3 times, Russia just a year ago, November. Throughout Europe, and certainly about every state throughout America. And we have our wonderful museum in Roswell. I invite each and every one of you, if you ever come stateside, you need to come to our museum. 250,000 people a year. Many celebrities who have gone out of their way and all of a sudden they just show up. If I mention Ozzy Osbourne, when his son Jack was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, MS, and it was a very rapid preceding ailment at the time. He made out a bucket list, the 10 things before he died that he still wanted to do in his life. Now this is his son. And one of them was go to Roswell and actually go to the crash site. And I quickly get the phone call, "Don, they'd like you to come down and take them out to the site." And as it turned out, whenever Ozzy would be on tour, when he'd return home, he would always bring his son Jack a few books that he would pick up on the road. 2 of them were mine. So we spent 4 days with Ozzy Osbourne in Roswell. Took them out to the crash site. And every so often, Ozzy would be in back of their motorhome, sitting there with the headphones on, and I'd walk by and I'd tap the glass and I'd ask, "Who are you listening to?" And he'd go, "Paul McCartney." "Who are you listening to now?" "Not Black Sabbath," his own group. So, again, a wonderful opportunity and drawn together because of Roswell. Because if there's one thing that I will stand for above everything else is that it rises up above everything else. Biggest story of the millennium. I went from a total skeptic to where I now say, I'm not a believer, but I'm 99% convinced. Big difference. Belief is a faith. Conviction is that you went and you proved it to yourself. You experienced it. You walked the walk. To date, we've interviewed over 600 witnesses who were involved, directly or indirectly. Over 150 first-hand witnesses. And we're going to be going through some of them this afternoon. We go through all of them, we'll be here a week. And I might get a little tired after the 6th day. So, has anyone here this afternoon actually been to New Mexico? It's very much like your outback, high desert, as far as open range. History hasn't changed it much in hundreds of years. In fact, the area where the debris field is located, the nearest town is Corona, which is pretty much a ghost town by today's standards. If I were to tell you that its high school graduating class last year had 5 students, that's about all that's left in the area. And so, when I talk about high desert and ranch land of 75 to 85,000 acres, just imagine a ranch that is 85,000 acres to sustain 500-700 cattle, maybe equal number in sheep, but it takes that many acres to feed, support that number of livestock. And you see it is open range. One of the things that especially comes across is that when we have been in small planes, helicopters, that once you are airborne, you can see for 50 miles. Now I want you to keep that in mind with the thought that the Air Force at that time was testing anything, had lost something. And it wasn't brought to their attention until a civilian would find it days later because they couldn't find it. Well, how could you not? Whether it was a mogul balloon or an errant rocket test or a secret aircraft they were working on at the time, they clearly would have discovered and recovered it long before any civilians became involved. It's amazing when you show these images to the skeptics and you show them that it's not in a forest, it's not in a jungle, it's not in a canyon or a mountainous area, it's wide open, high desert. How can you not find something if you're looking for something? And the point being, if you're not looking for something, it's because you're not missing anything. And if it's not ours, then whose is it? And so that's going to be the question this entire afternoon. If it wasn't the United States, If it wasn't something they were testing at that time, then whose was it? Now, a little background, a little history of New Mexico. Whenever I'm on college campuses, I will often ask, especially with the learned faculty present, where was the first atomic bomb detonated? New Mexico. You'd be surprised how many faculty, how many teachers will often, well, of course, Japan. How about 2 hours west of Roswell? In fact, when we were early into our investigation, we were talking to a lot of the elderly, and the only thing they were told back in June of 1945 was that it was an explosion of a munition site west of town. That's what shook the ground. That was some of the ash, the dust that you found in the streets, on the sidewalks the next morning. And then to listen to these people talk about how their cars were covered in this gray ash, the sidewalks, the streets, and how they just brushed it off. It was radioactive fallout from the first atomic bomb detonation. They were never told that. Ask me how high the cancer rate in New Mexico is. Extremely high. In fact, when elderly people for heart medication are on Coumadin, blood thinner, and you'll see how the blood pools up in their hands and their forearms just directly beneath the outer epidermis. That's because the blood is so thin. In New Mexico, when you see 30 and 40-year-old people already having that condition, and they're not on blood thinner. People are expendable to governments. And at a time when they didn't know if that bomb was going to explode or light up and ignite the entire atmosphere, they had no idea what they were unleashing. But it worked. And then to meet people who were just 2 miles down site, watching with binoculars the late Chester Lytle, who was the oldest living hemophiliac in the United States. And he was watching the flash, and he burnt a hole through his retina. Again, they had no idea. That's not Chester Lytle. Yeah. Your cat, Jamie? Yes. Yes, okay. And he's responsible. So. Yes, thank you, thank you. That's in your hands, not mine. So you had the first atomic bomb detonation in New Mexico. In Los Alamos, just north of Santa Fe, you had all the ongoing atomic research. Here at White Sands Missile Range, you had all the testing of the captured German V-2 rockets, all the attempted launches. Interesting that whenever they would have a launch, the little town of Socorro here, what is that most famous for? The Lani Zamora, Socorro landing in April of 1964. The egg-shaped craft with the two beings that were seen behind it. But when you talk to the local people, whenever there was a rocket launch, they would evacuate all the ranchers and put them up in a motel in Socorro. Not tell them what was going on. But it just created all the sinister impression of something very secret going on a regular basis. And here at the Roswell Army Airfield, just south of town, as I mentioned earlier, you had the 1st Atomic Bomb Squadron, the 509th Bomb Wing. So if I were to ask you, what was the most militarily sensitive region of the world back in 1947, I think I've made a pretty good case that it was New Mexico. And according to the Air Force Project Blue Book, there were more UFO sightings in New Mexico than anywhere else in the world at that time. It was as though someone else was very interested in our military potential at that time. And again, what better place? In the late evening of July 2nd, and we've confirmed a severe lightning storm through that region. And the ranchers described what sounded like an explosion between the thunderclaps. Didn't sound normal. Those are the Capitan Mountains in the background, southern tip of the Twin Peaks. And again, wide open high range. That's a monument that we placed out at the site. Most of us know the story of the ranch foreman, W.W. Mac Brazel, discovers a huge debris field that covers an area of almost a mile long. Now just imagine a balloon that would cover almost a mile long with wreckage. And I'm not talking about a little here, a little there, I'm talking about covered, strewn over an area of almost a mile long, up to this windmill that you see right here. It was called pump site number 1. The rancher, when he would report it to the authorities, one of the things he complained about was that he had to circle the livestock, the sheep who grazed in that area at that time, 2 miles around the debris field, just that they could get to the water. That in itself demonstrates just how huge the site was and how the wreckage was scaring the sheep. They were spooked by it. It would be fluttering around and blowing within the prevailing wind, which made it all the more difficult. Didn't matter that they were hungry, that they were thirsty. But this material was also frightening the livestock. Now, I'm not going to go through the basic story. We're going to jump around because I want you to think. And when I asked you a few minutes ago to consider something that was that unobstructed, that open, you'd have no difficulty finding something from an aerial reconnaissance standpoint. And you explain it away as being just a conventional weather balloon device. Neoprene rubber, reflective foil for the kite, the radar kite, sticks, string, and tape. Materials that a 5-year-old child would have recognized immediately. Off-the-shelf materials. And then ask yourselves, is it consistent that the very people who were in charge of the atomic bomb would have a problem identifying a balloon? But then, something the skeptics have never informed the public about. Where did those balloons even come from back at that time? Who was launching them? Who was assembling them? Well, the very personnel at Roswell. Because when they were conducting their bomb drop exercises, not using actual bomb casings, they were using sand barrels with the equivalent size and weight. But nonetheless, they would launch these very balloons twice a day in conjunction with these exercises, these flights of the B-29s with the sand barrels. So they were more familiar with the balloons than anyone. They assembled them. They launched them. It was a common activity at the base at that time. But nobody put two and two together back then, and many still refuse to do it because it completely then eliminates the balloon story, the balloon nonsense. Again, if I were to have that wreckage scattered right up here on the stage right now, rubber, foil, sticks, string, and tape, is there anyone here believes that they would misidentify that as a flying saucer? And yet the United States government is asking the public, the American people, the world to still believe that, still accept that after 72 years. I'm standing, if you see, that's the former west gate of the Roswell Army Airfield. You see that there's no road left. It's all, my thumbs are too big. It was a two-track road that circled north and then went west of town. So personnel from the base could bypass going through downtown Roswell and go to the north. And where were they going? To the debris field. For the next 2.5 years after heavy rains, the military was still going out and searching the area, making sure every last piece was confiscated. Now, what would possess them? What would require that? For years thereafter, they would still have to go out and search an area. Again, unless it was something so sensitive, so secret, that they had to make sure that none of the physical evidence ever leaked out to the public. Just imagine after they came out with the balloon story, and if someone was able to come out with an actual piece, and clearly was something manufactured somewhere else. The United States military would have a lot of explaining to do. And they weren't about to take that chance. They were making sure that they were always one step ahead of any possible whistleblowers, witnesses who might destroy that explanation. So this was the West Gate that they actually constructed at that time for the sole purpose of officers who would sneak out late at night. They would rendezvous with ranchers with horses. And rancher attire, they would then dress up like the local ranchers and then ride out to the original site and make sure that there was still nothing out there. This happened for 3 years after the incident, and we have the witnesses. In fact, Major Charles McGee, who served as a post at this gate just for those occasions, that he had to check them out as they left, and then he was the one who then checked them as they returned. This is Senator Carl Hatch. He was the senior senator of New Mexico at that time. Now, one of the things that we demonstrate in our chronological pictorial, it's a minute-to-minute, hour-to-hour, day-to-day, month-to-month, year-to-year account of what transpired at that time. And when we acquired the logbook of all the meetings of high-ranking officers, Secretary of War, politicians, meeting with President Harry Truman at the very day that this was all happening down in New Mexico. One of the principal people involved was Senator Hatch. Now, how coincidental that he was immediately called to meet with the president at the time of the crash, and then follow-up meetings as well, all indicating that something big, something extraordinary had happened in New Mexico at that time. General Lawrence Craigie was assistant deputy at research and development at that time, working directly with General Curtis LeMay. LeMay, who would go on as a vice presidential candidate, he would become Secretary of the Air Force. In later years, would rise to the rank of 4-star general. But Craigie would send his own chief of staff by the name of Games to go directly to New Mexico, go to Roswell, and report to me directly. I need you to be my eyes and ears there. And his name, and then Benjamin Games, when we finally tracked him down and talked with him, and he described to us that I reported back to the general in Washington. I reported what I saw, how I was briefed on the situation. And I can assure you, I did not brief him on any weather balloon device. I was sworn to secrecy. The general told me never to say another word about this for as long as I lived. That's as far as I'm going to discuss this. But he did still emphasize that this was something way beyond anything they expected. And he clearly ruled out it being a balloon, rocket, plane, or anything else conventional. I mentioned General LeMay. How many have heard the story of the late Senator Barry Goldwater and his attempts to see the physical evidence at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio? In fact, we have numerous letters from the late senator suggesting that I don't believe we're ever going to get the truth about Roswell because it's classified so high that no one has access to it. Well, when I talk about Senator Barry Goldwater, how many know that he was also a 2-star general? But LeMay outranked him at the time. So when Goldwater asked about seeing the physical evidence, how did Goldwater happen to know about it? Who informed Goldwater that he would then be so bold as to say, I know you have it, and I demand to see it? Well, it happened to be none other than the very base commander at Roswell in 1947, Colonel William Blanchard. And at the time that Blanchard spoke to Goldwater, he was a 4-star general. Now just imagine, in any military situation, you are 50 years old and you already reached the rank of 4-star. And especially after you have misidentified a weather balloon device and claimed there was a flying saucer. So much for his being reprimanded, being demoted, being made the laughingstock. Seems like he was promoted quite thoroughly. He was quite rewarded for going along with the balloon explanation after they made such a blunder. So it was Blanchard in the early 1960s, just before he died at the age of 50, told Senator Barry Goldwater / Major General Barry Goldwater all about what had transpired in Roswell. And we have that in writing from Goldwater. So he pursues this. He asks the then Secretary of the Air Force, General Curtis LeMay, Lieutenant General, 3-star, I want to see the evidence. I want to see the physical evidence at Wright-Patterson. And for those of us who know the story, what did LeMay say? What did he do? He responded, hell no, and don't ever ask me again. But that used to be the end of the story. Until Goldwater told us, because he was embarrassed, by what LeMay also said. And he told us before he died, the caveat that LeMay emphasized beyond, don't ever ask me again. When he said the Goldwater, and if you ever bring up the subject again, I will personally see that you are court-martialed. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we're talking about a weather balloon. And the Secretary of the Air Force telling the head of the Arms Appropriations Committee, Senator Barry Goldwater, who himself is a two-star general, if you ever bring Roswell up again, you will be court-martialed. Speaks volumes, doesn't it? It at least suggests that the subject is still, at that time, in the mid-1960s, almost 20 years after the original incident, still so sensitive, still so unspeakable, that even the officers in the highest ranks were being told, don't go there. Don't even bring it up. And if you try to, you're going to have holy hell to pay for it. That's Blanchard pictured at Roswell. You see, he's a quite statuesque man, about 6'4", 250 pounds. Secretary of War Stuart Simonton at that time. Blanchard's boss, Brigadier General Roger Ramey of the 8th Air Force at Carswell Army Airfield in Dallas, Texas, Fort Worth, Texas. These are all some of the main arbiters of the cover-up, the balloon explanation. Ramey was the main force behind the balloon story. We'll be getting into that in a few minutes. There is Ramey at a press conference. I'll give another more personal example. Colonel Blanchard, who after Roswell goes on to become a 4-star general, was a devout Catholic. We found nothing in his background to suggest that he was guilty of anything else but following orders. He respected, as far as his troops on the base, he respected especially the women working on the base. To the contrary, when we talked to General Ramey's chief of staff, Brigadier General Thomas DuBose, he described how if you had 2 legs and long hair, in other words, if you were a woman at his base at that time, you were next on his list. And then when General DuBose describes to us how he and General Ramey even had a bit of competition going back and forth. We had it all on videotape. And then after the general passed away, after General DuBose passed away, and his wife, his widow Mary, asked us for a copy of the tape. And we immediately knew we'd have to edit some of that out. And she went, I know what he told you. I know what he was talking about. Don't take that out. I want to hear him admitting it. Because it was common knowledge on the base that the 2 officers had very little respect for women back then. Whereas Colonel Blanchard did. And the irony that Blanchard became one of the fall people. That someone with the reputation of a General Ramey, his superior officer, would pull the rug out from what had happened over in Roswell and have the final word at that time. That, ladies and gentlemen, is nothing more than a weather balloon device. Now Blanchard, as I mentioned, is a devout Catholic. We suspected that he also might have added one Catholic touch that no one else considered, especially if you're dealing with bodies. We tracked down the base chaplain at that time because we suspected that Blanchard would have had last rites performed over the bodies. We were correct. Ramey's boss at the Pentagon was General Clements McMullen. Now, if I mentioned the rancher Mac Brazel finding the debris early morning of Thursday, July 3rd, 1947. He reports the find, he reports the crash. On Sunday, late morning, July 6th, he has to make a 75-mile drive, mostly dirt-packed roads at that time, beat-up old pickup truck. He reports it to the local sheriff of Chavez County in Roswell, Sheriff George Wilcox, who in turn reports it to the 509th Bomb Squadron at the base just south of town. Now we celebrate something over in the States on the 4th of July weekend. The 4th of July, our independence. Just as any holiday here in Australia, where would most of your military personnel be on holiday? At home with their loved ones, on leave. And yet, when the call came in from the sheriff's office, who picked up the phone because who was on duty that holiday weekend but Major Jesse Marcel, the head of intelligence, who we'll be getting to shortly. And it's important enough, the wreckage that the rancher has brought in, the artifacts, the fragments, the samples that Brazel has brought into Roswell are peculiar, are strange, are unusual enough that Marcel alerts the base commander, Colonel Blanchard. Holiday weekend, and it's important enough that he immediately contacts the base commander. Colonel, there's something you need to see here. And Blanchard, upon observing, handling the wreckage, he dispatches not a couple of enlisted men to check it out, a couple of grunts, as we would say in the States, low-ranking as far as a couple buck privates, that type of thing. He sends out his two lead intelligence officers. You see how, once again, it's all pointing to something very important. So Marcel, representing intelligence of the 509th, and the head of counterintelligence in plain clothes, predecessor to the American Central Intelligence Agency, Captain Sheridan Cabot of counterintelligence. In the event, it's something foreign. In other words, they can't identify the wreckage. So Marcel and Cabot follow the rancher back to the crash site. Meanwhile, Colonel Blanchard, he calls up his own boss, General Ramey. Well, Ramey is not at the base because, like most officers on the 4th of July holiday weekend, he's with his family at that time in Denton, Texas. So Ramey's chief of staff, Colonel Thomas DeBose, takes the call. The urgent message about We have a crash here. It's something we can't identify. We don't know whose it is, where it's from. So Washington needs to be informed immediately. So DuBose contacts the Pentagon. And it's late Sunday afternoon, July 6th, that DuBose receives a phone call from the Pentagon. General Clements McMullen, Deputy Director of Strategic Air Command in Washington at that time, calls him up and says, I want you to have the wreckage immediately flown to the Pentagon. Washington will already have wreckage in hand by late Sunday evening, July 6th. Now, when does the press release go out announcing they have captured a flying saucer? 2 days later. For all the talk that that was a knee-jerk reaction, an overreaction, they had 2 days to figure it out. 2 days to think about it. And Washington was now calling the shots. The timeline is so crucial, so important. The players involved. The fact that I can demonstrate to you that all the way to the Pentagon in Washington, they're being informed about what has just happened in New Mexico. All paints a picture of something much bigger than a balloon, an errant rocket test, or anything else conventional. It's all suggesting that this was something extraordinary. Secretary of the Air Force at that time, General Hoyt S. Vandenberg. And Vandenberg is immediately alerted to what has transpired in New Mexico. Why would he be contacted? Unless, again, this was something that his involvement was needed, that he needed to be informed and he needed to be involved. And believe me, and we're going to come back to him, he becomes much more heavily involved as the days would progress. Looks like a flying saucer, doesn't it? And you make out this kite. That's the radar kite of foil, sticks, string, and tape. Was anybody have a problem seeing that as a kite? Looks like it's from outer space, doesn't it? Why did the military back in the States, for days after the balloon explanation came out, put on public demonstrations like this all over America, driving home the point, trying to emphasize and demonstrate that, see, ladies and gentlemen, that when it's launched and once it's up at 10,000 feet and the air compresses the balloon and it becomes more elliptoid and it reflects the sunlight, you can see how you might mistake it to be saucer-shaped. That it might be something that is devoid of wings and tail sections, that maybe it is something not made here. And so they put on these demonstrations, and not once did a reporter ask, well, what about when it's on the ground in front of you and you can pick it up and actually handle it? And you can recognize the materials for what they are. The willing accomplices in the press already were getting their marching orders. And especially post-World War II. Military, and I know here and as well as in the States, walked on water. You know, they had saved the world as far as from Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan. And at that time, whatever they told you, whatever they said was gospel. And so they tell us it's nothing more than a weather balloon device. Aye, aye, sir. Yes, sir. End of story. Again, on the ground, absolutely no problem. I'm gonna come back to him. Minority Center at that time, Dennis Chavez. I'm sure here, just as in the States, where we have, in our case, the First Amendment, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, it's becoming more and more watered down. And especially in the States because of political correctness and the fact that anytime someone disagrees with you, you can accuse them of hate speech, discrimination, prejudice. But back at this time, it was still rather pristine. Because just as the military, the press were probably riding the highest level of credibility and respect that they ever did. Because they were our public watchdogs. They protected us from a rogue government or other organizations from doing something sinister, Machiavellian, behind our backs. We had to rely on our press to always be there and expose these people who maybe meant us harm, or maybe were trying to undermine, our very sovereignty within our respectful countries. And so, as the media in Roswell, specifically the 2 radio stations and the 2 newspapers, extant at that time, imagine you're at radio station KGFL and you have the true story of what has happened outside of town. A rancher has reported the crash of a flying saucer. There's a tremendous amount of wreckage. And there's talk of bodies. And you receive a phone call from a representative of the Federal Communications Commission from Washington. His name is T.J. Slowey. We have verified his working with the FCC at that time. And he calls up the radio station and he says, if you report one more word about this incident, you will lose your license to broadcast within 24 hours. You can't do that in the United States, or at least you couldn't. You'd have to be in direct violation of the FCC, and then you would get a dozen warnings before they would accumulate to the point that they would say, we're taking your license away. We're stripping you of your license to broadcast. But you get a phone call. And if you don't claim that this was nothing more than a weather balloon device, and if you say that it was anything else, you will lose your ability to broadcast. Total denial of your First Amendment rights. And that's precisely what happened. And not only did the FCC call up the radio station, a colonel from the Pentagon calls up and speaks to another reporter at the station by the name of Frank Joyce, who we're going to be talking about shortly. And he goes, I understand you talked to that rancher personally, who's making these wild-eyed claims. And Joyce, being a cocky 24-year-old, big, burly, he's the same size as Colonel Blanchard for that time, says to him, I don't have to tell you anything. I'm a member of the press. You can read about it in the paper tomorrow. And the colonel says to him, don't press me, boy, because you'll see what I can do to you. And Joyce says to him, well, you can go to hell. And the colonel says to him, when I get through with you, you'll wish you were in hell. And so they get one more phone call. They get a phone call from their own senator, who they voted for, who they duly elected, who's supposed to protect them. And Senator Chavez would say, it's out of my hands. I can't help you. I can't protect you. You better do exactly as they say. Again, what would rise to that level that even your own duly elected, in our case, senator, would say, this is so big, I can't even protect you from your own government over the situation. And I'm working at a radio station, and I'm duly licensed to, express my First Amendment rights. And they're saying, when it comes to this situation, it totally trumps, to use a card word, a playing card word, your situation. So you see where we're going with all this. You see, if you were the jury within a courtroom and I was attempting to build this level of significance, of importance, of extraordinary situation. Is there anyone here still at this moment who says, I still think it could be a weather balloon? That's fine, because I'm not through. This is Walt Whitmore Sr. He was the majority owner of KGFL. They attempted to get out to the site. In fact, he sent two of his own reporters up to the very ranch, and they nabbed Mac Brazel. They grabbed him, brought him back down to Roswell for the exclusive. They were going to make sure that they got the exclusive story. So they hid Brazel out at Whitmore's home the next night. So in other words, Brazel comes into town on Sunday, July 6th. He escorts Marcel and Cabot, the two head of intelligence, out to the debris field. See firsthand. While they are working the site, Brazel goes back to his chores, back to his work. And he's paid a visit by two of the reporters from the radio station. And Mr. Whitmore would like you to become his guest tonight. We're taking you back to Roswell. It's the evening of July 7th. So, in the presence of Walt Whitmore Sr. and the original reporter who was threatened by the FCC, Judd Roberts, they do a wire recording with Brazel. That was the technology at that time. Wire recorder. And guess what Brazel talks about? The bodies. He has seen the bodies. Not at the same crash site, but a couple miles away at another location. And the next morning, I'm going to make sure I don't, because here's a picture of Frank Joyce, and if we look, KGFL. It's from the time of the incident. It's a senior reporter, newsman, with the station at that time. He's already told some at the Pentagon to go to hell. Comes into his office the next morning, and his desk, his office has been ransacked. And everything that he had that mentioned the incident is now gone. They're showing him who's in charge. And where he originally was the first reporter who had talked to the rancher, when he first reported the crash at the sheriff's office. And he started talking about who's responsible for all that mess up at the ranch. I'm in charge up there. I'm the supervisor. And I can't gather that all up. I can't collect all that. There's just so much of it. Who's responsible? And Frank Joyce starts suggesting, well, it sounds like this is a military matter. You need to contact the 509th here in town. And then he describes how Brazel starts talking about his anger, frustration starts to become more somber, almost to the point of fright and concern. And he starts to talk about, it was just horrible. It was just horrible. And Joyce is asking him, well, what are you talking about? You just told me about all this funny wreckage. It was horrible? Oh, it was just horrible. You wouldn't believe it. You wouldn't believe it. Well, what was horrible? Well, the stench, the smell, it was just horrible. Oh, are you suggesting that there were bodies with the wreckage? You know, they're talking about possibly launching some monkeys over at White Sands. Maybe it was a monkey. And to which Brazel fires back, according to Joyce, they weren't any damn monkeys. They weren't human. And that was the last thing that Brazel would say to him, because from there they reported it, and you know the chain of the story. Once they contact the base, talk to Marcel, he speaks to the base commander, and then they follow Brazel back to the crash site. Now, after Brazel had done the wire recording that late evening of July 7th, Monday evening, July 7th, the very next morning, Whitmore has plans. He's going to put, Walt Whitmore Sr., they're going to put a live interview, a live broadcast of Mac Brazel over the airwaves at KGFL. And Brazel goes to a little diner just down from the radio station. And who should he run into after he's had a little breakfast? And we have first-hand witnesses who's met and talked to him at the diner. And then as he was just walking down the sidewalk across the street to go to the radio station, he was abducted by the military. They got him. And from there they went to the radio station, and they also confiscated the wire recording. Now, I'm not going to speak for Australia, certainly, but in the United States, if I were to ask an audience of Americans, what authority does the military have over civilians? I'd have to say absolutely zero, unless martial law is declared, state of emergency. Then and only then does the United States military have any authority. A four-star general couldn't tell me anything on my property or anywhere else unless martial law had been declared. And yet they grabbed the rancher. They took him out to the base. They didn't just question him. They kept him for 5 full days. They did not even allow him due process to call his own wife to let her know where he was. Call his attorney if he felt he needed legal counsel. And call his boss because he's no longer up at the ranch that he was responsible for. 5 full days. They didn't feed him. They only gave him a little water. They kept him up all hours of the night, asking him the same questions over and over and over again. And they subjected him to a full body cavity search. You think they were looking for pieces of a weather balloon? I know, it's so funny that it isn't funny. And when Brazel later would talk about the indignity, and he was a cowboy, he was a rancher, and when he's told to take his clothes off, and they start manhandling him. Again, over a balloon. Again, I don't care if it was an atomic bomb. The material isn't what's secret. It's the plans, the project. In the case of Roswell, it was the very physical evidence because it's the one thing that would prove this beyond all shadow of a doubt. I can talk till I was blue in the face about what I saw, but when I can actually show you a piece and it defies conventional explanation, all I need to see. You can tell me all you want, the sky is brown, but I see it's blue. And so Brazel is now no longer available. He's gone for 5 full days. The principal witness. Those of you who are former military and having holiday, if I might ask, would you take any additional leave after the holiday and then get docked for that as a separate leave time, or would you tie it in with the holiday so you wouldn't lose any additional days, if you understand what I'm saying? Because in the States, to tie in your leave with holiday, it becomes one solid package. You don't lose that leave time. You're away on holiday. Why would the base commander announce he's going on leave after the 4th of July weekend, after this all starts to play out, after the rancher comes into town? Unless he's skipping town, unless he's, I'm out of here, I'm not going to answer any questions about this. And in reality, what he does is he takes up operations. He's head of operations out at the crash site. He sets up shop, controlling the entire situation out at the crash site, where no press can find him. Nobody is going to ask him anything more at the base. So he's conveniently gone. The rancher is abducted by the military. He's out of the picture. And Major Jesse Marcel, which we'll be getting into shortly, is also then removed out of the picture. The 3 main people involved are eliminated from answering any additional questions on any of the situation. Here's Joyce as an older man, and when he finally confided to us about what was so horrible, a few days after Brazel, how much time do we have before we're taking break?
About 20 minutes.
About 20 minutes? I can go that long.
My wife's giving you an extra 5 there.
Yeah, because you talk too much, Jamie, so I don't know. And I'd have you talk another 10 minutes. It was wonderful. Thank you. But Mac Brazel, the rancher, he's been abducted by the military. They have him for 5 days. Well, they just don't hold him at the base during all that time. And for asking him the same questions over and over again, they finally get him to break. He finally starts to agree with them. So he's ready. He's been prepped. Well, more realistically, he's been reprogrammed. Because they start escorting him through Roswell. They take him to the 2 newspapers. He recants, he retracts the original story. It's just a weather balloon. I don't know why everybody got all excited about this. They take him to the 2 radio stations. And then when they take him to radio station KGFL with Frank Joyce, who is talked to him days before when he first arrived in town at the sheriff's office. He now meets the man for the first time. And he's thinking, finally, now I'm going to get the exclusive. I'm going to get the full story from the very man who I talked to just days before. And he's going to tell us about the bodies. And they go on the air, and Brazel's sitting across from him in front of the microphone, and he apologizes. And he says how he truly regretted that everyone overreacted to what was clearly nothing more than a weather balloon. He never meant that it would get so out of hand. He was sorry he reported anything. And Joyce is floored. He's flabbergasted. He can't believe it. And they go off the air. And Brazel gets up and starts to walk out into the front lobby, and Joyce follows him. And then Joyce looks out through the front glass door, and then he sees and he goes, oh, now I understand. And there are two military police, two MPs standing outside waiting for Joyce, or for Brazel. That's why he's there, because he's been brought in by the military to publicly retract the original story. And Joyce is asking Brazel, this isn't what you originally told me? What's going on here? And Joyce would describe how that Brazel, being the older of the two, stepped in front of him and said, son, they told me it would go awful hard on me if I didn't do exactly as they said. And he turned and started to walk out, and then Joyce asked him, but what about the little green men? And Joyce described as Brazel turned and went, but they weren't green. Well, he thought that was the last time he would see him. Next morning, Joyce arrives at work, not knowing what to expect, not knowing if the station was even still in operation. And his boss, Walt Whitmore Sr., pulls up alongside of him as he's walking towards the station. And he goes, Frank, get in the back seat. I'm on the air in a few minutes. Get in the back seat. Frank obliges. He crawls in, and there's a man sitting in a suit, just staring ahead, not acknowledging him, not saying a word. And they drive out north of town. And they keep driving. No one is saying a word. And Joyce starts to wonder if he's ever coming back. And they drive out to what was called the Hines house. Now this is just a one-room shack that's 3 miles north of the crash site, of the debris field. In fact, the other significance is the night that Brazel, the rancher, led Marcel and Cabot out to the crash site because the sun was setting, it was getting late, they spent the night in this very shack, where Marcel described they had some crackers and some cold beans, and it was a miserable, night in that regard, but the connection between the two. So now Joyce, they pull up, and Joyce is told by Whitmore, his boss, get inside. Again, he doesn't know if someone's waiting with a gun or if he should beg for mercy. I won't say another word, please, just let me go home. But he finally walks in, and it's empty. He's standing there all by himself. And within a few minutes, the door bursts open. And it's as though he's even been shoved in to the room. And who is it but Mac Brazel? Because the military still isn't through with him. Because now they have to shut up Frank Joyce. They've already taken care of Brazel. And Brazel is standing there, and he's going, Mr. Joyce, you're not going to repeat what I told you the other day over the phone, are you? And Joyce says to him, well, not if you don't want me to. Well, good, because you can't. You can never. And Brazel starts to walk out, and he turns back, and he says to Frank Joyce, you realize our lives will never be the same. And Joyce goes, no doubt. And then he walks out, and it's the last he would ever see of Mac Brazel. A few minutes later, Joyce by himself, he exits the shack. Whitmore, his boss, pulls up once again, but this time the suited gentleman in the back seat is gone. They drive back to Roswell. Not a word is said. Joyce is just dumbfounded, doesn't know what to say, because his boss is just staring ahead down the highway. They return to the radio station, and Joyce realizes that this was a major government shutdown, silencing, that they were making sure the witnesses and now the press were in full cooperation and were not going to repeat any of the true circumstances surrounding the incident. When I talked earlier about Brazel coming into town and first reporting it to the sheriff, Sheriff George Wilcox. Again, it's a 4th of July weekend, but the sheriff, his living quarters happened to be on the upper level of the courthouse. It was a hallway and a stairway that led directly down to a reception area and his own office. But what I didn't tell you was when Brazel brought in the wreckage, he brought in not one box, but 2 boxes of some of the relics, some of the artifacts. The military took 1 box because they didn't know about the other one. And who kept the other box? Sheriff Wilcox. Kept it in the bottom of his closet in his own office. And days after this all went down, this all happened, days after, Wilcox had dispatched 2 of his own deputies to investigate this firsthand. Again, why would the sheriff send out deputies to investigate a balloon? Days after, the sheriff himself went out to the site and witnessed more than just wreckage and a craft and bodies. Days after, the family heard what sounded like a commotion, the roar of vehicles, trucks, jeeps surrounding the courthouse, listening to men as they're yelling as they come in through the cafeteria, as they come in through the jailhouse, as they come in through the front entrance. And the 2 daughters, Phyllis McGuire and Elizabeth Tulk, step out in the hallway and they watch how 2 of the MPs physically accost their father, twist his arm up behind his back and push him face first into the wall of his own office and say, where is it? Where's that wreckage that cowboy brought in the other day? And he turns it over. Obviously, he turns it over. Now again, I would ask, what authority does the military have, not just over civilians, but the very lead law enforcement officer in the entire county at that time? Absolutely zero. In fact, Sheriff Wilcox could have gone on to the base and arrested anyone, including the very base commander, if he had just cause. But they have absolutely no authority over him. And to listen to both daughters describe and break down in tears what they witnessed as young teenage girls at that time, watching their father manhandled like that. And it was his job to protect them, to serve and protect the people of Roswell, including the Roswell Army Airfield. And their father was also cooperating with the military because he spoke fluent Spanish at that time. And when they needed some of the Mexican civilians who knew too much, who saw too much, who were involved, they relied on Sheriff Wilcox to serve as their proxy, to go and inform them that lethal force would be utilized if they didn't cooperate. The sheriff did cooperate, and that was the thanks, that was the payback he got. He never got over it. According to his daughter Phyllis, the incident destroyed him. Her word, destroyed him. He didn't run for re-election the next year. He died in a mental hospital just a few years later. Never got over it. In fact, the daughters also described that a few days after that situation, they called him out to the base. Well, he didn't trust them, so he took 2 of his deputies with him. And the daughters described that when he came back, his tie was all disheveled, his jacket was all twisted. They said it was clear that they once again manhandled him. They got rough with him. So again, ladies and gentlemen, what is this all over? What is this all about? I don't care if we even take flying saucer, UFO out of the equation. Does this again sound like anything as mundane, as simple as a weather balloon, Project Mogul, or anything else of that level of importance, security? Not even close, not hardly. And yet again, we're just getting warmed up. There's a picture of Sheriff Wilcox at his very desk because he was the one fielding all the questions for the military. Base commander was on leave. Jesse Marcel was going to the balloon press conference at Fort Worth with General Ramey. Those are his talking points on the piece of paper there. And all he was instructed to tell the press was, I'm cooperating with the boys at the base, and I've been instructed not to give out any information. This is, I could be, how much? 5 minutes. 5 minutes. Yeah, we can wrap it up, or at least end on this note, because we don't have a picture of Montoya. Senator, he was Lieutenant Governor of New Mexico at that time. Not this gentleman. We'll be introducing him in a second. But Lieutenant Governor Joseph Montoya, and he would become Senator Joseph Montoya of New Mexico. They called him Little Joe. And I'm not talking about Joe Cartwright of Bonanza fame, Little Joe, no. Little Joe. And 2 of his biggest supporters were, one of them was Pete Anaya and his brother Ruben. At the time they were called Montoyalistas because of their support of Senator Joseph Montoya. Well, it's during this entire period that one of the brothers gets a phone call. This is Little Joe. I'm out at the base. Because they had grown up together, they had gone to school together, and the Montoya brothers worked at a civilian capacity on the base at that time. I'm at the base. Come and get me out of here. Where are you going to be? I'll be at the water tower. I'm at the water tower next to that B-29 hangar. I don't know the name of it, but pick me up at the water tower. So Pete, pictured here, is brother Reuben, and another Montoya supporter by the name of Moses Prasad. The three of them drive onto the base. They're waved through because they have employee passes. They work on the base. They go to the water tower to the east side of the base facility. And there's the Lieutenant Governor, Montoya, standing. And he's all agitated, and he's pacing and moving back and forth. And he crawls into the back seat, and he's sitting there, and he's cupping his face, and he's shaking his head, and he's just, you wouldn't believe it, you wouldn't believe it. And they're just driving him back into town, back into Roswell. Should we take you to the motel? It was called the Nixon Motel back at that time. No, no, no. Take me home. Take me to one of your houses. I need a drink. I need a drink right now. You wouldn't believe it. You wouldn't believe it. And then he started to, they weren't human. They weren't human. They took him to Pete's home. And he sat down on a couch. Where's my drink? Where's my drink? And they brought him a bottle of scotch. And he started to guzzle it. He started to chug it down. And they pulled it away before he drank too much. And then he went on to describe, I'm here in town for the dedication of a new airplane. We found the pictures, him standing up on the dais with the plane in the background. They wanted me to come over to the big hangar. I had no idea. They told me to follow them. I went inside. And I saw all this funny wreckage scattered on the floor. And I thought, it doesn't look like a plane. Maybe it's rockets. I've never seen anything like it before. And then I was directed over to my right, and there was a canvas tarpaulin on the floor. And I saw the silhouette of what looked like children. Small, child-sized, silhouettes under the tarpaulin. And then as I walked a little closer, I saw that one was exposed. And it was moaning. And its knee was cocked and it was rocking back and forth. And I went, oh my God, it is true. It was a flying saucer. And they weren't human. We're going to take a break for half an hour. I'll be back as far as if anyone will be interested in the books. Please come back. It's only going to become more intense. I promise it's going to get even better, even more exciting. So with that, I thank you. Slide/PowerPoint presentations. And each one is a different aspect of this. One I just gave in Arizona was entitled Touched by Roswell, where I went through just a litany of all the celebrities, entertainers, TV, movies, politicians, scientists, all directly or indirectly involved with Roswell. And Jamie at the beginning, how many have seen the movie The Day the Earth Stood Still? Wonderful. And I'm sure most of you have seen Close Encounters of the Third Kind. My scientific director, Dr. Jalen Hynek, was the main consultant on CE3, Close Encounters, because who actually came up with that very classification? First kind, second kind, Dr. Jalen Hynek. He wrote about this in his book, UFO Experience, and it was published by Rigneri. The paperback edition was published by Dell, and it was right after they filmed the Devil's Tower scene with the mothership, and Hynek stepping out and doing his 7-second cameo. I'll watch that movie just to watch my dear departed friend, Dr. Jalen Hynek, step out, and I think of him every day, I truly do. And after they finished filming, we had a dinner party for Dr. Hynek at his home in Evanston. And we were all gathered, and then later I was back in the dining room with him. And I said to him, I asked him, I said, well, Alan, I suppose now Close Encounters is your favorite UFO movie. And he went, no, I still agree with you. It's still the day the earth stood still. And as Jamie had mentioned, that I had the wonderful fortune of knowing director Robert Wise, who did The Day the Earth Stood Still, and West Side Story, and Sound of Music, and the first Star Trek movie. And to then see him at the premiere of our Roswell movie at the Directors Guild in Hollywood, and the pictures of him with me, and he was shaking my hand with both of his hands, and he was going on and on. I am so proud of you boys. Does that make me want to quit this? And I'm not talking about the celebrity. I'm talking about the work, the investigation, the idea that all these people are counting on us to finish this. Because after now 72 years, it hasn't gone away. I often, and I made this comment on a Studio 10 show the other day, that I could have former presidents Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton, and I mentioned earlier the late Senator Barry Goldwater, and then the late Congressman Stephen Schiff of New Mexico, and the former governor of New Mexico, Bill Richardson, all sitting here, at the stage. And each one of them would lament the fact they couldn't get the truth about Roswell. So politics withstanding, I'm in good company. Because we're talking all the way to the President of the United States, having difficulty getting the truth behind all this. If I were to ask any one of you, if I were to say that in the Monica Lewinsky affair, that in Ken Starr, who was the prosecuting, the grand jury, the lead investigator, in his report, Roswell is mentioned, would any of you believe it? No, of course not. I didn't believe it until I heard what happened. When the grand jury subpoenaed the book that Lewinsky gifted him for Christmas, and they retrieved it from his private study, they found it sandwiched between two books. One was a book on Winston Churchill, and the other was an autographed copy to the President of the United States of UFO Crash at Roswell by yours truly. He had read it. And so I commented back at the table to one gentleman, or it was a young lady, about how all the witnesses are gone now. You can count the number of witnesses still with us on one hand. I'm talking firsthand, who handled the wreckage, who saw bodies, that type of, one hand. World War II generation, the attrition rate is to the point they're just about all gone. And every time I go to Roswell, it's a little sadder, more lonely. All those people, Ruben Anaya here, I knew him very well. Everyone I've shown you so far, if they weren't already passed on, I met them, I interviewed them, we talked to them. As I mentioned, over 600 witnesses, and they're just about all gone. So I'm here this afternoon for them. And you're here this afternoon also for them, whether you realize it or not, and I applaud you. Well, thank you, thank you. Thank you. So, we left with the then Lieutenant Governor, Joseph Montoya, saying they weren't human. And he then goes on to say, if any of you repeat what I said, I will say you're a liar. I will say that you are a crazy man. You don't know what you're talking about. Well, eventually, he had a private pilot by the name of Donald Worley. They call him Red. We would interview him years later, and he would just refuse to even acknowledge he had any association with Montoya, then or any time thereafter. But yet we had all the documents, we had all the testimony. In fact, eventually Worley came to Pete Anaya's home, would pick him up and took him back to the Nixon Hotel. That evening, Mary Anaya witnessed both of the brothers out in the front yard. And there was an officer from the Roswell Army Airfield, as well as a number of MPs. And there was a loud shouting match. And at one point, Mary thought they were going to be shot because it became that heated. And eventually, she could overhear the officer yelling as he was pointing his finger in their faces, saying, if you ever repeat another word about what happened today. Now, the brothers didn't see anything. They only heard what Montoya, had confessed to them. But they were being watched. They were watching the lieutenant governor. They knew where he went after he left the base. And they knew the Anayas were involved in hearing what had transpired earlier that day. It was just one of many examples of where, again, the military went entirely out of their jurisdiction, following orders from the government in Washington, where they were threatening witnesses, they were threatening people over this entire affair. There's a picture of Pete and Mary back around 1947. I'm going to move ahead to the late Frankie Rowe. Frankie just died 2 years ago. She was 14 years old at the time. Her father was Dan Dwyer. He was a unit chief with the Roswell Fire Department. Well, when the call originally came in to the sheriff's office about the rancher, Mac Brazel, the phone line where the call started also exchanging between the deputies and the sheriff, the same phone line also came through the firehouse. So the fire department was fully aware of what was happening just north of town. So Frankie's father took the initiative to go out to the site. So he saw the wreckage. He saw the remains of the craft. He saw 2 of the bodies. And he also saw a survivor. Just as Montoya describing the knee rocking and something moaning alongside the canvas tarp. Frankie had a dentist appointment that afternoon. And she stopped by the firehouse, expecting to see her dad. Her dad was north of town, wasn't available. And a state police officer by the name of Robert Scroggins, who happened to work the very county that this all happened in, Lincoln County, New Mexico, stopped by, see his good friends with the fire department on his way home, which was east of Roswell in the small town of Hobbs. And the state police officer pulls out this piece of metal about the size of a handkerchief. And one by one, they handle it, they examine it, they waved Frankie over. Come and see this. Come and see this. And Frankie describes how whether she or any of the men there, paper thin, weightless in your hands, it didn't even feel like you were holding anything. And no matter what you did to it, you creased it, you folded it, you crumbled it into a ball. You released your grip. And as Frankie said, it was like quicksilver. It just unfolded right before your eyes. It flowed like water and returned to its original shape and size. Perfect memory. We don't even have such material today because this was right there in front of you. Closest we have is an alloy called nitinol. It's a combination of nickel and titanium. But this nickel or nitinol, you'll take it and dip it in the hot water. And you withdraw it and it becomes like taffy. You can twist it, you can manipulate it, and then you stick it into cold water and then it returns back to its original shape. No sign of any damage. We have that today, but what they described in 47 was right in front of your eyes. Perfect memory. Material that you couldn't cut, you couldn't burn, even a bullet wouldn't penetrate. And Frankie is going through this same routine, and she's just amazed, as they all were. Never saw anything like it the rest of their lives. Well, that evening, her father is working the later shift at the firehouse. An officer shows up with three military police, 3 MPs. This is Lieutenant Arthur Philbin. And Frankie and her sister, Dory, they retreat to a bedroom. And they listen to the officer demand to know where Frankie is. And then the mother very reluctantly says, well, she's here, but what are you going to do to my daughter? Never mind, because you're all in trouble. Within a minute, the officer walks into the bedroom. He's got a baton, a police baton or an MP baton, and she described how he was slamming it into his hand. And as he told her, young lady, if you ever say another word about what you saw today at the firehouse, or repeat a single word of what your father told you, you will never see your parents again. And then Frankie started to cry. And then he laughed at her and said, go ahead. We'll take you out into the desert and they'll never find your bones again. We tried to track down Arthur Philbin. We discovered that he had been a New York police officer years leading up to the war, and that he died a young man, that he didn't go back to New York. He went to Nebraska. He was a very religious man at that point, served as a church usher, and belonged as far as, other groups within the parish, the church where he practices faith. And so we missed out on questioning him ourselves. And one day, Frankie gets a phone call, many years later. In fact, over 60 years later. Ms. Rowe, I'm passing through New Mexico on my way back home to Arizona. I need to stop by. I need to meet you. And Frankie, surprisingly, for all of her fear and intimidation through the years, in fact, Frankie, they found a wiretap, a phone tap on her home just a few years earlier. It had been there since the 1950s. It was manufactured by Motorola, which we confirmed, and it dated back to the early 50s. That's how long they were still watching her. Well, anyway, she couldn't believe that she invited the man to stop by. Well, Frankie calls me up. Unfortunately, I was home, and I said, well, you either need to call the police and just to have them at the ready, stand by in case you need them in a hurry. Or you could just leave. Let him come to an empty house. Frankie was living on a small ranch. Her husband, James, had just died a few years before. They lived in Portales, about an hour northeast of Roswell. And after James died, she moved back to Roswell, and she lived on a small ranch west of town. Well, anyway, she stayed. She wanted to see who this man was. And he would arrive. And she surprisingly answered the door. And she invited him in. And he introduced himself. Frankie, my name is Brian Philbin. I'm the son of the officer who threatened you back in 1947. If he were here, if he were alive today, he would want you to have these, with his arm behind his back, and he pulled out a bouquet of flowers and hands it to Frankie. Well, she broke down, he broke down. It was like, for the first time, the United States military and the officers who were just following orders officially apologized for what they did to all the civilians back in 1947. It was a striking moment. It was most poignant and demonstrative of the fact that those men back in 47 were just following orders. They were threatening civilians, they were threatening children because, again, it was all they could do to contain this. It was so big, it was all they could do to make sure people cooperated while they were trying to get answers. There was nothing in the Army field manual back at that time. Oh, crashed UFO, yeah, page 2, that type of thing. They were all just, floundering in the dark back then. They were just going about the situation as far as acting out on almost instinct, on adrenaline of how to deal with this. There's the fire station back in 1947. That's her father in the middle. We confirmed his testimony regarding, as far as even the survivor. There was a son-in-law by the name of Ken Letcher, who he confided to a year later before he married into the family, and said that you need to know this because my daughter may tell you certain things and you need to hear it from me first. You see the head? It's known as child of the earth. It's called a Jerusalem cricket. And when the family would ask Dan Dwyer, how did the bodies look? How did the survivor look? He said that the heads reminded him of the child of the earth, which is common down in the New Mexican area. You see the eyes, see the shape of the head. So it almost, again, similar. Now, keeping in mind, there were no UFO books in 1947. Even within the movies and into television series, the serials that were just in their infancy back at that time. Because television broadcasts were just starting back in 47. Buck Rogers, Flash Gordon, how did they depict aliens? Looking like us. They wore maybe spacesuits, silver coveralls, maybe a helmet, but they were human. How were their spaceships? They looked like rocket ships. And so, based on their own backgrounds, their own perspective, it's all they could do to describe what they experienced. One of Mac Brazel's sons, Bill, had a piece of the memory material. And after he acquired a piece before it was confiscated by the military, which we'll be getting into, he went over to impress one of the young ladies at one of the other ranches. Her name was Sally Tetralini. And she watched, after he got out of his pickup truck, how he would crunch the material, and every time he released his grip, it just smoothed right out. And her reaction was, my God, wouldn't it be wonderful if clothes would be made of such material and I would never have to iron again? A very human perspective, a human reaction. So I'm giving these examples because, again, these people had nothing else to base their perception on except what they were seeing. And then attempting to compare it to the most mundane, as even ironing clothes. This is Susan Farnsworth. Her father at that time managed the local Ford automobile dealership in Roswell. And he also owned, his name was Arthur Farnsworth. And he also owned a ranch north of town. And one day, her father took her for a horseback ride. They went out as far as to a very isolated stretch of the ranch. And he asked Susan what she knew about all the talk about the flying saucer. And she replied, well, only what we've been hearing, Daddy. I haven't seen anything. Well, good. You're not going to see anything. And your daddy didn't see anything. And if anybody asks, your daddy didn't tell you anything. But it is all true. When we got word, we went to try to find the location. We tried to find where it crashed. And we did. And it was before the military arrived. But then they did arrive. And they told me that if I ever said another word about this, they were going to hurt your mother and they were going to hurt you. And you know I wouldn't do anything that would ever threaten any of us. But please, I felt it was more important that you at least knew that it was true. But just don't ever ask me again. And that's how many of the witnesses behaved, how many of them addressed their families. It's true, it did happen, but please don't ever ask me again. That's from the actual city directory, Roswell Auto Corporation. There's a Ford in your future. That's the extent of investigation, the idea that, well, how do you know they were there back at the time? Well, we can document it. How do you know all those military personnel were actually there in 47? Well, we have the base yearbook, and their picture is right there. And then you get their personal records, and you find out where they were assigned, where they were stationed back in July of 1947. Graduations. Who was working at the radio stations? Who was the editor of the newspapers? Who were the editors? Who was the lieutenant governor? Who was the governor? Who was the base commander? In other words, we can place every one I have mentioned and hundreds more at the scene of the crime, so to speak. It's not a question of were they there, but a question of what did they see? What did they experience? And what did they actually hold in their hands? That's the showroom of the dealership. Picture receiving the award is Richard Loveridge. He was a crash investigator for Boeing aircraft in 1947. Now, why would a crash investigator from Boeing be called in to investigate Roswell and then be taken out to the crash site and be allowed to examine the wreckage and then be asked questions regarding the crash? And then why would he hold to himself all that information till he was dying and he would confess to his son? For years, he up to this point would say, don't ask me because they can hurt you. Don't ask me because they can hurt you. And then before he died, he finally confessed, I handled the wreckage. It was clearly not manufactured here. And I also saw the bodies. Deathbed confessions, admissible in a court of law back in the States, physical evidence for a reason. People just do not lie before they die. That's why, at least back in the States, our judicial system acknowledges that, and that's why they're even defined as deathbed confessions, deathbed testimonies. It's the reason that very often when a person is close to death, they will bring in a member of the clergy to take one last confession. Now, can you imagine any one of these people, a husband, a father, within days before his passing, let me tell you one last lie before I go. Let me make up something just that, be your lasting memory of me. We have over 24 deathbed confessions at Roswell. And invariably, each one talks about the ship and the bodies. And of the over 24, over 20 describe the survivor. That there was indeed a survivor at the crash site. After Mac Brazel left the ranch, well, I should add, he arrives back at the ranch after he's been abducted for 5 days. He arrives with a new pickup truck. He arrives with money to buy a meat locker up in Denver, north of New Mexico. He was described as barely having 2 nickels rubbing in his pants pocket to his name. And all of a sudden, it's as though he's been paid off for his silence. And that's his son to his right, your left, Paul, and then his other son, Bill, who I mentioned earlier, who displayed a piece to Sally Tetralini and clothes not being, having them be ironed thereafter. So Mac is standing there as a security guard because he did that for a few years. He passed away in 1963, barely in his early 60s, as I recall. And according to the family, of J.B. Foster, who owned the ranch, when J.B. received a phone call. His daughter, Joanne Purdy, overheard the call, in which her father said to the caller on the other end, "Well, wouldn't you know, old Mac finally did it. He committed suicide." Now, the Brazel family would never accept that. They don't believe that. But the family of the owners of the very ranch that this all transpired back in 47 believes he committed suicide because of the effect it had on his life, the fact that it changed his life, the fact that he couldn't keep any jobs, he couldn't go anywhere with people the moment they would hear his name. The level of ridicule. When I talked earlier, if I were to ask, where did the ridicule factor? I know it's here also in Australia. It's certainly extant back in the States. And I can demonstrate it all the way back to 1947. In fact, all the way back to Roswell. That's where it began. General Roger Ramey, one of the arbiters of the cover-up, the weather balloon explanation. Days later, he was doing a radio interview in El Paso, Texas. And he was asked by the radio host, "Well, General, that explains Roswell. Just a weather balloon. What about all the other sightings? Isn't it true that there are flying saucer sightings in every state throughout the country?" And Ramey responds, "Yes, that's true. Except for Kansas, which is a dry state. In other words, they have prohibition there. In other words, only people who drink and over-imbibe are seeing these things." The birth of the ridicule factor. So it can be documented. That's his daughter, Bessie Brazel Schreiber. There's my partner, Tom Carey, and myself at her home in Portland, Oregon. There's a granddaughter by the name of Fawn Fritz. There's Fawn at the monument. I mentioned earlier to somebody the Stone Cairn. And every time we have brought film crew or even directed people out there, because the stone monument is a quarter-mile away from the actual debris field, because it's still an active archaeological site. We're still protecting it, keeping it as pristine as possible. And every time someone is out there, we instruct them, now place a stone on the cairn as a memory that you've been here. Within the last 2 weeks, someone was out there and capsized, tipped over the entire cairn, and going in different directions. So it wasn't where somebody pushed it in one direction or even something moved it. No, it's like somebody was shoving it in different directions because it's all scattered in a circular pattern. Now, why would somebody do that? I don't think anybody here in this room, no matter how much of a prankster, or even if you don't believe or don't think there's anything to this, that you would desecrate something that to us is almost like a battlefield shrine. If you accept what happened, then we're talking that an intelligence, whether human or not, died here. And the foreman of the ranch, who's now Eddie Davis, and his hired hands, are constantly catching Air Force personnel out at the site. To this day. Lot to see. What do you think they're looking for? When we had our first archaeological dig in September of 1989, we mapped out the site and we laid out a systematic grid and we marked areas of potential entrapment. We used shaker boxes along a gouge area described by the witnesses. We were getting ready for the next dig and the next dig and the next dig. But first you map out the site. We had archaeologists from Argonne Laboratories from Illinois. We had a doctor on site because of the rattlesnakes and the scorpions and tarantulas, and the nearest doctor is 2 hours away. And Dr. Jerry Vermeulen, the last day we were there, he calls me aside and he goes, Don, now I guess I can admit it, but I didn't want to say anything, but I forgot the anti-venom. We've been out here for 4 days and now it's okay. But I said, okay, your secret's good with me. Mark, George, I was saying, we were leaving. We had packed up. The drive to the first paved road is another good hour. And we pull on to Highway 247, which would take us into Corona. Remember I talked about that ghost town graduation class of 5? On our way back to Albuquerque to then all fly to our homes the next morning. We were going to fill up with gas in Corona, the Lone Shell gas station. We get to the paved stretch of 247, which is then 19 miles into Corona. And there's a Jeep parked off to the side of the road. And there's a man standing in Air Force fatigues. Now mind you, this is a late Sunday afternoon. And he's talking on a two-way radio. There were no cells or anything back then of any. I mean, he's talking on a two-way radio. And it was a convoy of 4 vehicles. My scientific director, Dr. Mark Rodiger, who then took over for Dr. Hynek when Hynek passed away. He's sitting in the front seat and he does one of these looks at me like, oh, that's interesting. We drive a few miles and there's another one. And now Mark's getting nervous and I'm just sitting there and it's like, I told you. We drive another few miles and there's another one. Another Jeep, man standing in military fatigues, also talking on a two-way radio. And then Dr. Rodiger turns around and he goes, Don, I think we're in trouble. And I said, just keep going. We haven't done anything wrong. Let them make the move. So we drive the rest of the way into Corona. We pull into the filling station. And all at once, another vehicle, another Jeep, comes roaring up alongside of us and has 2 men in it. And one of them jumps out and he goes, we're not from around here. We're looking for a good place to go hunting. Can anyone suggest anything? And I was the one who said, we're also outsiders. Go ask the filling station attendant. And we get into our car and it's like, get going. We're just going to Albuquerque and hope we get home. Well, nothing else happens. We make it home. A week later, the ranch foreman, Jeff Wells at that time, and fortunate for us, Wells and one of the owners of the ranch, Donald Bogle, came out that Sunday afternoon to send us off. Say goodbye. Now, what I didn't mention intentionally was the fact the debris field site itself is conservation property. It's called Bureau of Land Management. The Department of the Interior, who serves as the main cabinet post for the BLM, strictly for government-owned conservation property, which is leased back, in this case, to ranchers for strictly grazing purposes. No other, you can't excavate, you can't, even for all the excavation we did, we had to put everything back and it had to look as pristine as when we arrived. And when the foreman and the owner came out, they were making sure everything was as immaculate as it was before we arrived. So Wells calls me up and he goes, Don, you're lucky we can cover for you because we saw how perfect you left the site. The BOM was just out here, 2 of their officers, and they are as angry as could be. And you're lucky we can vouch for you because after you left, multiple vehicles were out there spinning and tearing donuts and as far as digging up the site with their vehicles as much as they could. Does anyone hazard a guess of who that was? And it was intended to make sure we'd never be able to come back, that we'd lose our permit, and that would be the end of any. But again, we know how to anticipate. We don't project, we anticipate, and then we try to stay a step ahead of you. And it worked, because we've been back 4 more times since, and we're going back again next year with another archaeological dig. So we're winning. We're winning on all these fronts because we realize the stakes are so high, and that if this was something as mundane as a balloon or anything else, why is the United States Air Force still looking around out there? You think it's to see if there's anything still that will rise to the surface after a rainstorm or something else? Again, it's not to see our monument. It's Geraldine Perkins. I'm going to skip her. She had the only phone back in 1947. And Brazel at the ranch house, no phone, no radio equipment, no electricity, no running water. So he had to rely on her phone to call up his boss, J.B. Foster, whose main ranch house was in western Texas. Now, there too, why would you be calling up your boss who's 500 miles away to come to his ranch because you have a balloon scattered across the plain? Again, unless it was something much more important. Robert Shirkey was a first lieutenant back at that time. He handled and saw some of the wreckage. He's describing as far as some of the lengths of some of the I-beams. Sergeant William Ennis, Frederick Benthal. Benthal was a photographer with the Army. He was stationed in Washington at that time. He arrives in Roswell and he's taken out into the desert in a vehicle with the windows all covered. He gets to a site and they have a number of tents set up. And he's escorted over to a tent and he said, we need you to photograph everything on the ground. They open it up and there were 2 of the bodies. And he photographs them. They confiscate the camera with the film, and he tries to ask questions about what this was all about. And it's basically, you had your assignment, you performed your duty, now go back to Washington. Well, within a week, he was reassigned. Northern Greenland. That's one of his pictures. Talked to a lot of people up there about what happened down in Roswell. In fact, I showed you Shirkey. Right after this happened, Shirkey was reassigned to the Philippines, where there was nobody to talk to, nobody he could exchange notes with. So we discovered more and more that either people were quickly resigning from the military or they were getting reassigned. Like one of the nurses at the base hospital who was quickly repositioned at a base outside of London. So we saw this pattern. And one of the mistakes we made at the beginning was when we were wholesaling squadrons, units. Like the 1295th was the MP squadron at Roswell. So obviously we assumed that the entire unit was assigned to be security over the entire recovery operation. They weren't. Would have been too obvious. They were selecting men from each different squadron unit on the base. And outside units came in from Fitzsimmons in Colorado. An MP unit came in from White Sands, Holloman as far as Army Airfield. Counterintelligence officers came in from Carswell in Fort Worth. And special flights were coming in from Washington, transporting evidence back and forth. So imagine if all of us here in this room belong to one unit, and you're all assigned one specific mission. What happens then when you return back to your housing, your barracks that night? You can all talk. You can all exchange notes. You can all share perspective, memories, whatever you just experienced. But what if you're the only one? You're the only one. What are you going to say when no one else has just experienced what you have? So it was also a way that they shut down all the talk. It was rather ingenious. In other words, they learned well from World War II. Remember the old saying, loose lips? They learned well, and they exercised it with masterfully at Roswell. This is Corporal William Quigley. He was with the 393rd Bomb Squadron. See the tent, the panels that are erected around this B-29? The first body flight, so as you see that, I'm going to describe a few things. First body flight that went out was piloted by Lieutenant Colonel O.W. Pappy Henderson. Before he died, he confessed to his wife, Sappho, and his daughter that he flew bodies and wreckage out from Roswell directly to Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio. The first wreckage flight that went out was on a B-29 called Dave's Dream. That was the flight that Major Jesse Marcel was on. And its original destination was also Wright Field, but halfway there, they altered course and went to Carswell, where General Roger Ramey was waiting with a room full of reporters, and they had the infamous balloon press conference, where they substituted the remnants of the balloon for the actual material. Those are the photographs you've seen. And so, the second body flight was called the Straight Flush, another B-29. It was a unit where they were called from the firing range to take a special flight directly to Carswell in Fort Worth. Our flight from Roswell. Well, the evening before, there was a corporal by the name of Edward Harrison. He was part of an Native American unit. He was with the 1027th Air Material Squadron. And they were sent to the far south end of the base, far south end of the tarmac, where the incinerators were, where they burned the daily garbage, refuse from the base. And there was a 7-foot wire mesh fence erected, and inside was a tent. And they were posted around the tent for the night. But what is a tent doing here? And why is it surrounded by a fence? Well, they were relieved duty halfway through the night, and when he arrived back the next morning, the fence was gone, the tent was gone, and all they could see were the tire tracks of a B-29. B-29 bomber had picked something up from that tent during the night. Well, Corporal Quigley described how he was called to duty after he had finished guard duty throughout the afternoon. This is on Tuesday, July 8th. And he was posted behind one of the B-29s over bomb pit number 1. And they had all these screens erected. Because whenever they did that, it was because they were actually hoisting an atomic bomb into the bomb bay of the waiting B-29. There were no atomic bombs on the base at that time. In fact, America did not have any atomic bombs in its arsenal at that time. We had just dropped the 2 over Japan. That's all we had at that time. So what was going on behind the screens? Well, it's an example of the bomb pit. The bomber would pull over the opening of the pit, and they would hoist up. They would jack as far as the bomb, into the bomb bay. They even experimented with letting the air out of the tires, allowing the plane to sink and descend down to the bomb at times, because they were having trouble. So they constantly experimented with it. But again, there's no bombs on the base, July of '47. It's where the 2 pits were located. Signs at the sites read, anyone crossing within 200 feet of this location, lethal force is authorized. In other words, these were the 2 most sensitive sites on the base, because when they would be used in their normal capacity is where they would have an atomic bomb. Okay, setting that all up, that's the site today. It's just asphalted over. The particular squadron was with the 393rd, straight flush. Their actual aircraft was, you see, what does it say? Necessary evil. Now, I'm just mentioning all this again because to show you how this comes together. Why? They're pulled from the firing range, the skeet range. They have a special flight to go to Fort Worth. This is 4 o'clock in the afternoon on Wednesday, July 9th, a day after the weather balloon explanation has hit all the newspapers. Their regular aircraft is necessary evil. They are assigned the aircraft straight flush. They would learn later that the reason they couldn't use their own aircraft because there wasn't enough space in the bomb bay, because it was still full of all the radio equipment. It was the weather spotter plane for Enola Gay. First B-29 dropped the bomb over Hiroshima. Again, it's a matter of historic fact. Necessary evil, the weather plane, and the fact that the radio equipment remained in it. And it would not serve the urgent purpose of what was just about to transpire. So straight flush was substituted. We talked to the pilot, we talked to the crewman, we tracked down everyone that we could still find alive who was on that flight. Arthur Osachuk, Felix Martucci, Robert Slusher, Lloyd Thompson, Robert Ewing, all on that flight, and they all confirmed the following. Here's Lloyd Thompson, Robert Slusher. There he is on the Roswell Army Airfield basketball team. There we're talking with Slusher at the actual bomb site. Arthur Osachup. They taxi over bomb pit number 1. And it's under heavy guard. We found one of the guards who was posted at the site and who would then accompany a rectangular crate that was hidden at the bottom of bomb pit number 1. And it's hoisted into the bomb bay. And the guards accompany the crate into the bomb bay. They taxi, they fly over to Fort Worth. Felix Martucci was the bombardier as far as the squadron. He recognizes waiting with other officers on the tarmac at Fort Worth a mortician he had gone to school with years before. Now, why would a mortician be waiting for this crate? And then Martucci, after he got out, greeted the gentleman, got back onto the plane, and as they took off, he made the comment, which has been corroborated by 4 others on the flight. He made the comment, "Boys, we just made history." It was the second body flight. I'm going to skip that. Up and Adam, I'm going to skip Anderson. How much time do we still have? Because I want to have a good Q&A.
We've got an hour and about an hour.
Would that include a Q&A?
We can get a Q&A in there. No, it won't include a Q&A. That'll leave us some time for a bit of a Q&A.
Okay.
Okay.
The head of that particular squadron, you see, it's Major Edgar R. Skelly. He was retired lieutenant colonel. And when I first called him, he laughed and made the comment about Martians. That, oh, you're chasing after the Martians. Well, don't you have anything better to do? Well, because everybody kept pointing to him, who were part of his unit, I obviously didn't give up. I found him in Riverside, California, which is about an hour east of Los Angeles. I announced I would be paying him a visit. I showed up, and he came to the door in his bathrobe and slippers. Totally forgot, or so he claimed, that he was expecting me. And he excused himself and said, well, let me go put some pants on. And as he did, his wife took me aside and said, you have to get him to talk. I've been trying for years. Every time I try to ask him about Roswell, he walks out of the room. I said, I'll give it my best. He returned, we went into the front room, and I brought up what his own men described as I just described to you. Now just imagine you have men by the name of Arthur Osachup, and that you wouldn't recognize that name. Or how about Thaddeus D. Love? You might remember that name. And it didn't matter who I mentioned. No, weren't my unit. Didn't matter that I could show him the unit pictures. Didn't matter that I could show him the assignments. No, don't remember one of them. And then he'd go, you have to understand, I was in a little car accident a few weeks back, and I bumped my head. And so my memory, I don't, please, you have to understand. But then he kept coming back to why do you need to know about this? And I would go, well, Colonel, if it's true, it's one of the biggest stories of all time. Wouldn't you want to know about that? And then he'd come back, well, why do you need to know about it? And the point being, he's not denying anything. It's just that he can't recall, he can't remember, but he kept throwing it back. Why do you need to know the truth? And I brought up to him what had just happened. Remember when I described Mac Brazel, the rancher, leading the two head intelligence officers, Major Marcel and Sheridan Cabot, head of counterintelligence, plain clothes. Their assignments were to track and intercept Soviet spies back at that time. And so I'm with, at that time, Colonel Sheridan Cabot at his home in Sequim, Washington. And we had tried for years to get him to talk. We couldn't even get him to acknowledge he was at the base in 1947. Until each time we returned, we had documentation. Well, Colonel, how do you explain this? How do you explain this assignment? How do you explain one of your own men, Louis Rickett, describing you and him going out to the crash site? So I'm leaving the last time, and I say to him, Colonel, you're a true patriot. You truly know how to keep a secret. You're to be complimented. And he's thanking me. And I go, but Colonel, one last remark. What gives you the right withholding it from my generation? Those of us who weren't even born back in 1947. You have decided for all time. What gives you that right? And he kind of muses for a moment. Gee, I never thought of it that way before. But I'm still not going to tell you anything. So here I am with Colonel Skelly. So I mentioned that. So I said, so I understand where you guys are coming from. You're still under lock and key. You still are under strict regulation. You took an oath. And the oath was never to say another word about this. It was a non-event. It didn't happen. It didn't matter that you put out a press release claiming it happened. It didn't matter that the Air Force at that time was now up to 4 official explanations. I always joke, husbands should try that if they get home too late with their wives. But I can assure you, back in the States, they're up to 4 official explanations. And the only one that there are witnesses to is the first one, which is the flying saucer. Not a single witness to the subsequent 3. Not a one. And I'm talking to Skelly almost on that same level. And he keeps, oh, my head, I bumped my head. And then I found, okay, I want a shortcut getting back to LA. Can you help me out? And he's telling me exactly which street and which corner and everything. And I said, gee, thank God you hit your head. Your memory certainly, is sharper than ever. And he just leers at me because he knows I got him. And so on the way, as I was leaving, I take his wife aside and I said, I'm going to have all the crewmen who were on your husband's flight call you and see if you could put a team together, see if there can be something that collectively, that eventually they would call him themselves and they would say, Colonel, you know what happened back in 47. We were all on that flight. How can you deny it? And she loved it. She felt that this would be finally the solution that she had, had failed and that I had failed at for the time I spent with her husband trying to break him free from his oath of security. And so I started lining up all the other men. Arthur Osachuk, Robert Slusher, Lloyd Thompson, Robert Eubanks, Lloyd Thompson. They were all ready and willing to do it. I call her up a month later. give her the good news. And she shouts into the phone, "Don't you ever call this number again, and if you do, I will report you to the police for harassment." And I go, time out, time out. Please just let me ask you one question. When I left, did your husband call anyone? This is all I will tell you, Mr. Schmitt. He made a call to Colorado. He spoke to some general. And I said, oh, his name wasn't General Paul K. Carleton, was it? Yes, it was. Oh, well, he's the one that's overseeing all the witnesses. He's the one who's now making sure none of the witnesses talk. We keep hearing his name, P.K. Carleton, General Carleton in Denver, who's now running the show. And she went, "I have nothing more to say," and she slammed the phone down. I could give a dozen other examples. Now, I'm not talking in 1947. I'm talking into the 1990s and the 2000s that we're still running into that. Again, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, over a weather balloon in 1947. Rubber, foil, sticks, string, and tape. And yet, American media, each and every time I'm interviewed, well, doesn't the government say it was just a weather balloon? And as Miles O'Brien, he was the science editor at CNN, and we had just filmed at the very hangar that wreckage and bodies had transited through. And we were off camera, and he says to me, "Don, you spent a good part of your life working on this. Why are you doing this?" And I looked him square in the eye and I went, "Because you're not." He didn't talk to me the rest of the day. Didn't like that, because it was true. I can't tell you how often Phil Jones at CBS News, Peter Jennings, his producer, told us, "We know you have a big story here, but you have to understand, we can't touch it. They won't let us." And it always comes back to, who are they? Who are they? If I were to be asked right now, where do you believe the wreckage, the physical evidence is? You believe I would say, well, of course, the government. You'd be wrong. Then you would say, well, then certainly the military, because they confiscated it. They were the ones who recovered it back in 47. They've always been right there to snatch that evidence out of anyone's hands. I never thought I would say this, because I don't want to, and I'm always careful that I'm not accused of being any type of conspiracy nut or buff. I hate that term. Where was the very term conspiracy nut first applied? Who actually coined the
President Kennedy's CIA.
CIA. Next time someone says that, you tell them, well, guess who came up with that? And why did they come up with it? And so, when I really think about, you look at again the situation, and it's the same here. Does the government, does the military manufacture, produce anything? A single tank, plane, boat, ship, bullet, anything. All private, correct? All the private sector. all the corporations. When I can demonstrate that within days after Roswell, where was the material going? To Boeing, to Hughes Aircraft, to Rand Corporation, Bureau of Standards, General Electric, Motorola. Why? To figure it out, to find the on button, to reverse engineer it if possible, to give the Pentagon the answers that they couldn't come up with. So when I'm asked today, where's all the physical proof? And my partner Tom Carey and my associate Anthony Bragalia, we 100% say the corporations. The very thing that I thought I would never admit, that when Dwight Eisenhower warned the world of the military-industrial complex, that they were taking over, they were calling all the shots. And I don't mean to, because again, it sounds conspiratorial. But again, I have to look at it black and white. And when I have first-hand witnesses at all those corporations, do you think they gave it back to the military? Or do you think they, well, give us another few years and maybe we'll figure it out? To the point that as the new chain of command comes in, they even forget where everything is. When you have Ben Rich make the comment, we have the technology today to take E.T. home if we wanted. Again, I'm getting a little speculative here, but I can definitively say that when it comes to where is the evidence buried today, I would say the major corporations. And then we will never see it again until they can capitalize on it and profit from it. Remember the last scene in the first Indiana Jones movie, Raiders of the Lost Ark, with the Ark of the Covenant, and actor Harrison Ford playing Indiana Jones, he's being assured by this politician that as they spoke, the Ark of the Covenant was being tested by some of the greatest scientific minds in the country at that time. And you see the next scene where it's being lowered into the crate and then nailed shut and then being wheeled into that hangar just full of all the government secrets or all the corporate secrets where things are never seen again. Keeping in mind that the level of human arrogance who would suggest that we're not being visited, there's nobody else out there, we're it, we're kings of the universe. The same people that would say, well, if one drops in our lap, we'll be able to get right inside like Will Smith did in Independence Day and just drive that thing like it's a hot rod that we just souped up ourselves. Human arrogance. And that's why I also remain convinced that if you can't bridge the technology, how are you ever going to find the on button? How are you ever going to make it work? And that's another reason, the corporations, we're working on it. Just give us a little more time, we're figuring it out. Because again, the government can't do it, the military can't do it. They have to rely on the private sector to provide them with the means. And I'm sure it's the same way here. You see, here's an example of one of the yearbook pages. Believe me, everyone on this page, we made every effort to locate, interview. More times than not, they were already gone, but 603rd Air Engineering Squadron. Would anyone hazard why an air engineering squadron would be assigned the actual recovery of the bodies? Because they'd be the last ones you would suspect. And yet they were. Every one of the men who we tracked down who were involved with the bodies was with the 603rd. Because we never would have guessed. It was as though even in 1947 they were anticipating us, or anyone who would start looking into this. That's George Hulk. He drove the high-low, the flatbed, with the remains of the egg-shaped craft, about the size of a Volkswagen Beetle, like a capsule, a pod. That was at the impact site. You had a debris field, and then you had a final impact site where a capsule, like an escape pod, was located, and that's where two of the bodies and the survivor were discovered. This is an artist's rendering. You see the high-low, the flatbed. And we even tracked down two of the paper boys who were on each side of Main Street in Roswell, who described to us independently the convoy coming down Main Street, because they were that bold. Granted, it was covered. It was under a canvas tarp, but it was the only way they could get back to the base. This is Sergeant Earl Fulford. He was part of the recovery team. Talked about with a sack on his back as he was grabbing up pieces, and he would crunch them in his hand, and he stuffed them into the sack, and he could feel them opening up and jabbing him and poking him as the memory material was returning back to its original shape. Again, a human description, a human reaction, but just you can put yourself in it. Feeling, the jabbing as the material is, opening up, returning back to its original shape and size. I don't know why that hanger, there's with Fulford. Sergeant William Ennis was with the 393rd Bomb Squadron once again, a flight engineer. In other words, the B-29s, they were called the silver plates because when they would polish down the aluminum, it would become as shiny as chrome. And he would tell us how they could take a B-29 apart down to the last rivet and put it back together again. That was their job. And before he died, he put his hand on my shoulder and he said, "Don, before I go, you have to find out how that damn thing flew. It didn't have a moving part on it. So how do you reverse engineer something that has no parts? No moving parts." So then you start thinking about, is this thought projection? You climb into the seat and your mind tells it what to do. And we're getting close ourselves. Self-driving cars and other equipment that is going to become more and more voice, thought projected. So it's not that far-fetched. And the fact that they were thinking of that even back in 1947. I mentioned the chaplain and last rites. Last name was Reverend Hankerson, and how he confessed to his family, and he kept talking about it opened my eyes to my faith when I realized that we were just here on one planet and how many more there most likely were. That was the church. In more recent times, this is how it appeared back in 47 on the base. And there you see city directory once again. Elijah Hankerson, and he was the chaplain on the base at that time. I'm going to see what I have here. Yes, there's about 5 minutes before Q&A.
Let's have a look. Yeah, 5 minutes would be great.
Okay. You see, this is from the base yearbook. Staff officers. And you see in your upper right-hand corner, Major Jesse A. Marcel. That's the name that has become synonymous with the entire incident because he was the principal officer involved. He's the only one that was mentioned in the very press release that went out on July 8th of 1947. He's the one that then went over, he was ordered over to Fort Worth where General Ramey, they had the balloon press conference and Marcel was ordered to pose with the substituted radar kite. I think most of you have seen those pictures. It's clearly just foil and rubber, sticks, tape, and string. Nothing extraordinary about it. Colonel Joseph Briley in the middle on your left. He was the one who informed us that Colonel Blanchard's lead was a blind that he actually went to assume as far as operations out at the crash site. And then the other two were already gone. But the one on the right-hand lower corner, Major Patrick Saunders. Saunders retired lieutenant colonel. When I first found him and talked to him down in Dallas, Texas, actually from here I should say over or up, right? I mean, I'm sorry, I'm speaking from my perspective from Wisconsin. Old habits, I'm sorry. And he too joked about Martians and why you looking into something that we immediately explained away as being a balloon. And then when he died, he passed away in 1995. And his family alerted us that he'd bought up as many copies of the paperback edition of our book, The Truth About the UFO Crash at Roswell. And he sent them out to his best friends, gave them out to his family. And inside the inner leaf, he wrote, "Here's the truth, and I still haven't told anybody anything. Pat." Handwritten deathbed confession. Here's the truth. And again, our book is not about a weather balloon recovery. You see that not only has this become a passion, a quest, but the fact that I can take all the pieces of the puzzle, no matter whose involvement, whose participation, and I can plug it in. No one is contradicting anyone. It's as though they're all reading from the same script. I don't care if it's a 5-year-old child or a 2-star general. They all are talking about the same event, as though they're all reading the same story. But it's nothing they've read. It's something they've experienced. It's something that after all these years still defies conventional explanation. Why else, if anyone witnessed the last time that Bill Clinton was on the Jimmy Kimmel Show, one of our talk shows back in the States? This is all they talked about. And the president went on and on. I had 8 years in the Oval Office and they couldn't get the truth about Roswell. Well, what's the truth? What is the truth after all these years? Well, here's Colonel Saunders saying, here's the truth. You think he did that to his family as a last fleeting joke? His best friends? One last prank? One last practical joke? I'm going to leave you with this. And then we'll do some questions and answer period. And I mentioned this at dinner last night. It's called the Rashomon effect. It's from a 1950 Japanese movie dramatizing a Japanese murder trial. And both the defense and the prosecution present the argument that 10 people witness an event, 10 people describe it differently, based on their backgrounds, based on their human experience in life, their education, their religion, their occupations, what have you. It all influences the way we perceive things. Why is it that all the witnesses at Roswell perceive it one way? And yet, the Rashomon effect, the very principle is, you have your opinion as to what happened, and then I have my opinion as to what happened, and then there's what really happened. Now, I challenge anyone who here would say, well, I'm still skeptical. As I often have dealt with the Philip J. Classes and the Joe Nichols and the James McGahas and all the skeptics we have back home. Which, yeah. When it comes to who is making the effort, having their own opinion, to actually determine what really happened, I would challenge any one of you to show me a single skeptic who has their opinion, but their opinion is, I'm telling you what happened. I'm telling you what to believe. I'm telling you what you should believe. As opposed to, in our case, where I can say it's still a fluid investigation. I said earlier, I'm 99% convinced because I still want to hold a piece of the memory material in my hand, but who is still making that effort to determine what really happened? Big difference. And if there's one thing I hope you all leave with this afternoon is the fact that we are still hot on the trail. We are still making every effort to find out what Bill Clinton and others of that high authority are saying. We couldn't get it. We couldn't find the truth. Because all I need to do is read that. And even from his grave, even posthumously, Colonel Saunders is saying, it happened. It did really happen. We're talking the biggest story of the millennium. This room should be overflowing. And again, the sad thing is that most people, and I'll be quite frank about, they just don't give a damn. The United States government could announce tomorrow, this is all true. Half the people would, sad, but not you. And that's why, again, I applaud you. So, with that, I thank you. I hope we have some questions. I'm sure we will. But we could go on many more hours because there's that much. There is. And based on the books, there's nothing repetitive in any of those books. It's all, the children, the officers, the cover-up. I talked about how they covered up, how they attempted to silence the press. One of the books I deal with, how did they silence the civilians? How did they silence the military? What did they do to the politicians who tried to get involved? They. And that's what we need to be all the more cognizant of, aware of. It's not just Roswell, it's just not UFOs. It's many more aspects throughout life. So if there's anything that we all take home with us this afternoon is that everything isn't as it appears. Everything isn't as we want it to be. And the best thing we can do is arm ourselves with information, knowledge, so at least we won't be caught unaware and we can decide what's best for ourselves, our loved ones, our families. And that's the biggest lesson I take away from Roswell. And the other big lesson I take away is I make wonderful friends along the way. And I'm sure, I'd like to believe that all of you will fall in that camp this afternoon when I say, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. So. Thank you.
So just keep an eye on that time for me down the back, and we'll go ahead with the Q&A, and I'll run to you with the mic and try and keep it succinct. But I just want to say a couple of words, because I have never experienced in my life, and I mean this emotionally, someone as passionate, as informative, as descriptive, and whose soul is on fire to resolve this mystery. And what governments expect, they expect us to give up, to lose steam, to lose our strength. And I barely know a skerrick of what this individual's been fought through. But I understand by going out to face the media, when you're passionate about this topic, when it's touched you, that you are going to become a target. You might as well draw a bullseye on your head. And no matter how eloquently and discreetly and scientifically you lay out your argument, they will shoot you. So to your courage and tenacity,
Thank you.
I applaud you.
Thank
And
you.
so does
Thank
the
you.
audience.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Hello, Don. Thank you.
Good
That was,
afternoon.
fascinating. I wonder if you have any further information on the beings who are on the craft. You know how they say one had lived on. I'd like to know if they received any medical attention, and also
Another whole talk.
sorry, and also with the TTSA. Do you think get on board with this? Do you think they could have any influence in finding out what really happened?
I mentioned earlier on, we have a museum in Roswell. It's been there now for 26 years. And to this day, we do not have an accurate portrayal of the bodies. Now, why would anyone hazard why we haven't done that? Because up until now, we have had potential witnesses. And the thought that we would rather not influence or lead a potential witness by showing them, in other words, you maintain your control information. You hold the most sensitive information to yourself. So lest you potentially contaminate people. Law enforcement, for example, they often will put out even disinformation with the hope that, because they get hundreds of leads, they get hundreds of, people that come, and I did it, they confess, and they, just for the sake of publicity, notoriety, that type of thing. And we've often had that with Roswell. And when the moment they start describing what they've seen at the museum, that hardly qualifies them. Does the opposite. Next year will be the first time that we're actually going to have a holographic figure of the survivor. And it's going to be within a glass container, and the people that we're working with, if they are able to holographically pull it off, it will react to the people around it, and especially the children. And that's what, one of the things, it's a long answer, but it's again forthcoming. It's something that we're very excited about, looking forward to. One of the things that came across with the witnesses to the survivor over and over again, and one of them is, his name is Elazar Benavides. He was a MP guarding the bodies at the hangar. It's called P3, Building 84. And then he escorted them over to the base hospital with a contingency of other guards. And one of them stepped on a sheet, pulling it free. And Benavides was standing right there, and he looked down, and the eyes opened up. His wife described to us, until she died, that for 40 years they could not sleep in the same room because he kept jolting up in the middle of the night, and he would scream out because he couldn't get the face out of his mind. It took us over 2 years to get him to talk to us. And when he finally did, he wept like a baby, like a child, for what he had seen, what he experienced. But the one thing, whether it was him, Sidney Jack Wright, Mac Brazel, George Wilcox, there was a deputy involved, there was a Lazenberry that was involved as far as with the bodies. The one thing that came across over and over again was there was nothing threatening about them. There was almost a sereneness, a peacefulness, that they almost looked innocent, childlike. And you think for all of us who have seen images of, and I don't like the word aliens, but how they're most of the time depicted. They look ominous and monstrous and scary. I never got that feeling at all with the witnesses at Roswell. And so it took us, we've been working with special effects artist Mike Hill in Hollywood, who does all this perspective as far as bodies in the movies. Some of you might watch the AMC series Walking Dead, and they do the heads and the faces. That's what they do. And so I've worked with him for 5 years until we capture that level of innocence in the face. We have it. And that's why we're now going to do the hologram. Because I want children to be able to walk up to it. And if they smile, it will smile back at them. I often, when I speak to young people, we'll go outside and I'll tell everyone to wave. Wave up at the stars, because you never know what little children out there are waving back. I think it's one way to demonstrate, as far as especially for the next generation. The greatest thing we have to fear are the people that are calling the shots and telling us how to live our lives. Not those who may be out there, who know enough to leave us alone, and that's why they don't land on the White House front lawn. Because what's the first thing we would do? We would probably shoot them. We're, the hostile race that needs to come down once again to our childish roots and acknowledge that all we're trying to do is get through life and with as the least pain and suffering as we can, and help one another get through it, because after all, that's all we're here for. Help one another get through this. And maybe they could too if they didn't see as being like as the late John Keel suggested, we may be the universal insane asylum. All the crazies are here.
It's too wrong there, actually.
Thank you, Don. I just wanted to ask you, when you say that the corporations have got the remains of the craft, I'm just trying to refer back to what I've heard about Donald Rumsfeld trying to explain $3 trillion of military money disappeared. Would that be like military black ops working with the corporations?
Good question. Good question. And especially the question about, he was 2 times Secretary of Defense, first under President Gerald Ford, and then secondly under George W. Bush. And he originally was a congressman from Illinois. And guess who one of his constituents was? Dr. J. Allen Hynek. And when Hynek testified before Congress in 1966 on flying saucers on UFOs, who introduced him with the most glowing terms but Donald Rumsfeld? Well, years later, when Rumsfeld was in Washington under Gerald Ford, Hynek thought, I'm going to stop by and see my old friend, Donald Rumsfeld, because I want answers. I devoted almost 20 years of my life to the study of this phenomenon, and I walked away with nothing. They told me nothing. So we had the meeting in Rumsfeld's office, and he says, I deserve to know something. I deserve to have the truth about something that I gave the government 20 years of my life to. And he described how Rumsfeld came from behind his desk, walked over and leaned over him, and with his finger in his face went, you have no right to know. It's because they do know. And as far as they're concerned, we are nothing to them. They owe us nothing, they give us nothing, and that's why in that type of a situation, they in their eyes, the means always justify the ends and vice versa. And I would say it's because Rumsfeld, they are in a pool of people, even above the president, because they have this truth, and even a Bill Clinton couldn't get to it. So, okay?
Yeah, thanks, Don. Very good speech.
Thank
just
you.
Wondering, if the ET craft is so advanced, why couldn't evasive action be taken rather from the craft to avoid the crash? And secondly, why didn't the other ETs come and and rescue the surviving alien and take him back to their own planet for probably better medical treatment.
First of all, anything that's manufactured is malleable at a certain level. If we think back how, as far as where the fracture point, the stress level of our materials back in 47, it's easy to surmise that we were down here in 47, maybe in 2019 we're now up here. And whatever comprised as far as this object was way up here. That's why when I would say it was nearly indestructible, whatever caused it to break up, whether it was struck by lightning because we can document there was a severe lightning storm at the time, or it was an internal malfunction. It reached that fracture point. It broke up, okay? As to any attempts to search and rescue, Dr. Lincoln LaPaz was a famous meteor expert back in the States at that time. He was part of the Manhattan Project. He investigated the Japanese Fugal balloon bomb phenomenon. And he was assigned in Washington. He arrives in Roswell in September of 47, 2 months after, with the assignment to determine the speed and trajectory of the craft. Well, why would you need to know the speed and trajectory of a balloon? So again, another disconnect. So the gentleman who was assigned to work with him was Master Sergeant Louis Rickett of Counterintelligence Corps, who worked under Captain Sheridan Cabot, who was with Marcel when they first went out. And according to Rickett, they spent 3 weeks in the field. And LaPaz's technique was to determine triangulation in finding impactors. They all talked about within days. There were objects that were hovering over the area with spotlights projected down as far as attempting to find something at the site. There's absolutely no record it was any of us. We had all the wreckage that remains in our possession. So Rickett and LaPaz concluded it was them. They were looking for one of their own. And within a week, the son of General Nathan Twining, who was head of Air Material Command at Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, told his son that there had been an infiltration, that there was an unknown that had come over the base, and they scrambled on it, and they chased it away. And where was the Roswell wreckage at that time? At Wright Field. So again, it's a bit speculative on my part, but I'm telling you what I can. It's one thing if I can tell you from their vantage point what they were attempting to do. I can't. Nobody can. But the fact that such circumstances did take place, I can relay that to you. So.
This person behind.
Oh.
Hey Don, thanks for coming to Sydney. Today's been great.
Thank you. Thank you.
A couple of years ago I went to Roswell and I did a tour of Roswell with a guy named Dennis.
Yes.
And that to me was spectacular. I'd be horrified if that tour was to cease operating, because he said that he's probably only got another 5 to 10 years left, and he fears that there's no one left to take over him when he goes.
Mm-hmm.
So firstly, are you aware of what he does, and are things being looked at to make sure that these are ongoing afterwards?
You're talking about researcher Dennis Balthaser, who does a tour in Roswell. His tour sites are all locations that we established. So he's doing that all with our permission. And I know Dennis very well. Dennis used to always be our go-to person in New Mexico after we would head home. In my case, Wisconsin. In Tom Carey's case, Pennsylvania, the Philadelphia area. So we needed, as we would compile all these new potential leads, we relied on Dennis to follow up. You know, get us a location, get us addresses, phone numbers, that type of thing. He was very good at that. And since we're now out of witnesses because we're running out of time, he started the tour. Now, Dennis has approached me, not that he's going to do this for 10 more years. He thinks maybe only 1 or 2 more years because he is getting older. And at that point, we are already schooling someone to take his place. And most likely we'll be through the museum, that Dennis would still be a supervisor in that capacity. But we're going to do everything we can to keep the tour going. Out to the base, out to the, the different residents within Roswell that are all part of the history, the landmarks connected to 1947. So we're going to take care of that.
Right, we're questioning on talent, but there will be time for Dawn. Gentleman at the back here, downstairs after this. So just one more question, was it, Marie?
Thanks, Don, for your great discussion today. I'm just wondering, is there any evidence to show that there were items retrieved from the craft that were the basis for lasers and Kevlar and night vision and all that sort of thing? And have you had any threats against yourself for doing all this sort of thing?
And the other thing we need to realise too is that the museum in Roswell is open for donations. It's creating an extraordinary library, a worldwide library. If you have any books that you're going to get rid of involving this subject, especially Australian books,
Yes,
get in
absolutely.
touch with that library.
Absolutely, absolutely. One of the artifacts described at the debris field was like a silken strand of material, like a microfilament, like fishing line. And the witnesses described that you could hold a light source up to one end, and the light would emit out the opposing end. Well, what are they describing? Fiber optics. And yet fiber optics weren't developed until around 1970. So that could be one possibility. As far as the memory material, Wright Field contracted Battelle National Laboratories just down the road in Columbus, Ohio, within weeks after the incident to make a concerted effort to develop self-healing metal. That's in the progress report. Well, what does that sound like, self-healing metal? Well, memory material. And I mentioned nitinol. The end result was the compound, the alloy, nitinol. Aside from that, I still maintain it's a cover-up of ignorance. We still don't know from where, from why, or from who. We still can't find the on button. Again, I talked about that human arrogance, the thought that we would be able to pick up, no different than this laptop, and to teleport it back in time and they'd be able to figure it out. We can't bridge the technology. It's that simple. And that's why in many respects, they have nothing to disclose because they still don't have any answers. They can tell you it's true. We're being visited. We're not alone, but not much more. I want his question yet because I know who he is and so.
Yeah, and the other thing what about any threats on your lifetime?
Oh, yes.
I'll let you answer that one, Don, if you like. I'll ask these two questions as well. One thing that I'm really interested in is if it's true that a craft has been recovered, and I think you just touched on this, why haven't we seen technology in the air, or are we already? Like, for example, the lady here was asking about TTSA, the To the Stars Academy.
Yes, yeah, I'm sorry, I want to address that too,
Do you think it's possible that what we're seeing off Guadalupe is retro-engineered technology? And final question, why not disclose? Like, if they do know something like this, as you say, it's the biggest secret of the millennium, why not disclose it? What's stopping them?
And in conjunction, as far as what I failed to answer, as far as with you, as far as the To the Stars Academy, and with Tom DeLonge and Robert, I always joke that I knew Robert Bigelow Aerospace, when he was just a multi-millionaire. Because Bigelow originally would meet us down in New Mexico, and he funded not our efforts, but Stanton Friedman's efforts. And when they made the announcement that Bigelow Aerojet actually has physical evidence. First thing that we did was, I wanted to make sure it wasn't Roswell. I've been assured it has nothing to do with Roswell. And then what recently was publicized that DeLong, that they paid $35,000 to have a piece analyzed. All they would have had to do was ask us, and we'd have told them the piece was junk, because it was when it was analyzed 20 years ago. They're talking to the wrong people. They're intentionally avoiding the wrong people because in many respects, all they're using this for is to raise money as far as their own project. And they're using UFOs as a front. I don't mean to sound that, well, I am. Because Tom DeLong believes that Roswell was nothing more than a German bell. Has he ever talked to me? No, he refuses to. Has he ever talked to a single witness? No. Has he ever been to New Mexico? No. Then why are you saying this? And it's like, again, I work for the a police department in Chicago, and I go into New Mexico, and I go, I'm taking charge. I've never been here before. I don't know anything, but I'm going to tell you what really happened. That's Tom DeLong. Again, I have zero respect for the man, because you don't come into my house and then tell me how to arrange the furniture. The whole situation we have to keep in mind as far as with Robert Bigelow. He has the mission to Mars contract with NASA. That would tend to jeopardize his association with NASA, which is outspokenly critical of the UFO phenomenon. Why is he doing that? Why now? Now, one possibility is the Air Force have been the deceivers on this topic for now 72 years. It hasn't been the US Navy. I've talked to a number of the pilots involved, such as Fravor, and he agrees with me in the sense that the Navy is finally getting fed up with the Air Force always telling them what to do. When the Navy has the best pilots in the world. Air Force doesn't even come, if there's any Air Force here, I apologize. But I also belong to the EAA in Wisconsin. We have the annual air show in Oshkosh, Wisconsin. And I can assure you the best pilots, even there, are all Navy. Because they have complete global surveillance. The Navy, the Air Force is just strictly within sovereign airspace. You know, it's hardly touching the subject. And they hardly would have access to what is going on globally. The Navy would. So that's the one hope I have, that maybe the Navy is finally going to be more outspoken. The problem with disclosure, as I mentioned, is quite simply when you have nothing to disclose. Well, just imagine an American politician, say it's the president, say it would even be the Pope. But just imagine any politician that would step out and say, ladies and gentlemen, I'm here this evening to tell you that we are not alone. We are being visited by an intelligence off the planet. They're able to fly through our airspace with total impunity. We can't touch them. We don't know where they're from, or who they are, or why they're here. But vote for me come next election. Again, I keep using the term, they can't find the on button. I remain convinced of that. Because I see nothing in our technology. I mean, our cars, I mean, each year incrementally, you know, they become a little bit more advanced, but we're still driving internal combustion cars, and we're launching rockets, and we're flying jets, same as we've been doing for the last 75 years. Where's the breakthrough? Maybe fiber optics was the one thing. After all, it's just a piece of glass. I mean, I often find myself saying to young people, I hope in your lifetime I don't believe it's going to happen in my lifetime. I saw it too often with Dr. Hynek. We had it happen to us a number of times. Get ready. It's coming out. We were told on one occasion, all of you need to get ready to come to Washington. We've selected a handful of you and we want you all to make plans individually, separate means of transportation. Come to Washington. It's going to be an announcement. Before that, it was Dr. Hynek. He'd be rushed to WGN in downtown Chicago. We just got a tip. Washington's making a big announcement on the subject tonight. We want you immediately here for reaction. Here we are in 2019. Still nothing. I hope the Navy, as I said, that's the only way I can see it happening, but I'm just warning everybody, be prepared that at some point they may come out and just announce it's just some of our new, sophisticated, state-of-the-art equipment, and that's what it was. And once again, gotcha. You know, all the gullible, individuals within ufology that immediately, raised the flag that today it's going to happen. Keeping in mind that when that first article came out in the New York Times, Leslie Kean, and as far as the whole situation, as far as on the Nimitz and Tic Tac, that's now going to be 2 years ago. And they promised us there was going to be part 2 in January of 2018. What's going on? These are things that we can control, and we're not. So again, I'm sorry for sounding cynical, but it's also the nature of the subject matter. Because the secret keepers are still masters at their craft. So on many subjects. So
I'm sorry, we will have to leave it here, but Don will be with us downstairs. We have to evacuate this room for a wedding. But can I be so bold to say, ladies and gentlemen, this is disclosure. The courage in this bed is the truth.
Thank you.
And if you're seeking the truth, history, as Napoleon said, was written by the winners. It's like a grain of sand. You have to hold it so strongly in your palm, and Donna has tenaciously for decades.
Thank you.
So thank you so much.
Thank
Donna.
you. Thank you all.
Next meeting is November